Chapter 101, Aftermath. How could you do such a thing? McGonagall yelled at Dumbledore angrily while Flitwick backed her up with his own questions. Both of these professors had a very good impression of Nick, so learning that Dumbledore had violated his privacy in such a manner set them off. I understand your anger just as I also understand the young man's. Please understand that I truly only wanted the best for the boy. He was afraid of the power I held over him, and since he clearly had a bloodline, I assumed having him tested would help set his mind at ease. I had never guessed that his bloodline would be what it was, and while I admit to knowing about his reluctance to be tested, I assumed it was just that, reluctance. Dumbledore said, defending his actions. You didn't get the blood necessary for the test with his permission, did you? McGonagall asked coldly, and the old man grimaced, since that was indeed the worst part about this situation. It was public knowledge that many dark spells or curses require the blood of the victim to be willingly given. However, Dumbledore had exploited the loophole and used his authority as the magical guardian to use it without Nick's consent. Nick groggily woke up in the infirmary an hour after that whole event, which wasn't hard to believe since Snape didn't hold back at all. Ugh, my head is pounding. What the hell happened? He wondered for a moment before he remembered, and that same rage came over him. Madame Pomfrey seemed to feel the magical disturbance he was starting to create and rushed over to him before slapping him upside the head with a newspaper, snapping him out of it. You have every right to be angry, but don't let it control you, you daft child. She scolded seriously. But... Nick went to protest, but she stopped him. I am a healer, child. I know the implications about what Albus did better than almost anyone. I am not saying not to be angry, merely that you not let it cloud your vision. Did you even notice that you came close to crossing a dangerous line earlier before Severus stopped you? She asked gently, and Nick froze as he realized he was about to legitimately try and kill Dumbledore earlier. Sure, it was in the heat of the moment, but that was unacceptable behavior no matter what the reason. Nick closed his eyes and took several deep breaths while bringing his emotions and magic back under control. I'll be fine now, he said as he opened his eyes and had a neutral presence. Would think you used a clemency if it wasn't clear you took too long to relax. No matter, I suppose. You should have quite the headache, no? The elderly nurse asked with a gentle but serious look. Nick nodded. I'm a bit fuzzy of the details. Why though? He said with a frown. The woman nodded. That'd be Severus's handiwork. It would seem you must have frightened him greatly for him to use a fully powered stunner on you. Not that I can blame him much. You truly carry a scary presence when angered, she said honestly while reaching into a satchel at her waist and retrieving a small potion vial. Here, drink this. It should help, she said, and Nick downed the potion without a word, though he did make a face. Madame Pomfrey seemed satisfied with this and handed him his wand and the mail that caused this entire situation. You may want to finish reading that before I let your visitor speak with you, she said before walking away. Visitor? Nick thought, confused, since his friends ought to be in class at the moment. He didn't even get a chance to read the second letter in the pile of things as the instant Madame Pomfrey was gone, a silvery see-through woman in a long dress floated out of the nearby wall. Nick was confused at this, as he wasn't aware that the Grey Lady ever went to the infirmary. The pretty ghost floating in front of him with a curious expression as she looked him over. Can I help you with something? Nick asked, uncomfortable with the intensity she was using to stare at him. Read the letter, I'll wait, she said simply after a brief moment of confusion on her part. Nick was confused why she would care about his heritage, but found out when he read the letter and had a look of disbelief on his face. Nick shook the semi-crumpled mess next to him and quickly found the signet ring that confirmed that the letter wasn't lying to him. He groaned at the realization of the sheer ungodly amount of drama and politics that is bound to come from this information. Chapter 102, Chatty Helena. So how can I help you? Nick asked, not letting it slip that he was aware of her identity when she was alive. I sometimes forget that my identity isn't well known anymore. I am Helena Ravenclaw, daughter of Rowena Ravenclaw and sister to your ancestor. The ghost introduced herself proudly. Well, now I'm at a bit of a loss since I'm not sure how to introduce myself anymore, Nick said honestly while rubbing the back of his head. Helena paused for a moment and thought. What were you called before you found out? She asked calmly. Nicholas Iron, he answered honestly, and she fell into thought again. What about Nicholas I Ravenclaw? She suggested helpfully. Nick let the name roll around in his mind for a moment before nodding. That'll work for public events and business talks, though I prefer just being called Nick, he said honestly. Why are you acting so nice to me anyways? Everyone says you are a bit standoffish normally, Nick inquired, interested to learn more. Humph. They are not family, you are, it's entirely different. she said disdainfully, like merely talking about others wasn't worth her time. Alright, so she's arrogant, makes sense I suppose considering who she is. Nick thought with a mental shrug, since he has no room to judge someone for being prideful. You still haven't told me why you are here talking to me though. He pointed out calmly. She looked taken back for a moment before chuckling. Despite the side content, you still remembered the main topic. Yes, you are certainly related to myself, she said happily. To answer your question, however, I have for a long time assumed that someone like you simply didn't exist. You see, your ancestor was my younger sister and was born a squib. My mother was quite distressed about this, you know, to the point she hid all information in regards to my little sister's birth. One day shortly after she was born, mother took her away and then simply didn't return with my little sister. I never asked what had become of her and had simply assumed that mother had left her in the woods somewhere to die. You can imagine my surprise to discover that she had survived long enough to continue our family line, Helena said enthusiastically. Nick was a bit weirded out at how happy this ghost seemed compared to her book counterpart that was very quiet and broody. You seem relieved for some reason, Nick said, trying to see if he could get some answers out of her about this weird situation. Tisk tisk, no need to try and coax answers out of me since you could just ask, Helena said teasingly. Fine fine, way to take all the fun out of it. I am trying to figure out why you seem so much more cheerful than what was said to be normal, he said with a bit of complaint. Oh, you see, the thing I regretted most from when I was alive was how the family died out with me, but thanks to your existence my biggest regret is gone. Sure, I have a few other regrets, but that was definitely my biggest one, she explained happily. I see, and this thing doesn't really give me anything, does it? Nick asked while holding up the signet ring. Helena looked at the ring with nostalgia for a moment. Quite the opposite really, mother made sure to work out a special deal with those foul creatures so that our family's vault would never be reclaimed by the goblins and would instead be active forever in case someone like you were to show up one day, she said with a chuckle. The greedy little things ought to be furious that there was an heir to the fortune this whole time right under their noses. Be careful around the things or they'll trick you with a shifty deal in order to empty the vault for themselves, Helena warned seriously. Besides that, you need the ring in order to find our family home. Mother placed special wards on the place so that only the current lord or lady with that ring could find it if they weren't keyed into them, she revealed casually. After 1,000 years that house would be rubble by now surely, Nick said seriously. Ha! As if mother would let something like that destroy what was hers. No, she instead tied a self-maintenance enchantment to the ley line under the island to keep the house in perfect condition regardless of how much time passed. I helped set it up, I will have you know, Helena said proudly. Wait, island? Nick asked in surprise. Yet if you bring me a map of England I could point out where it's at, or I could just go with you over the summer to point it out, she said honestly. Chapter 103, Possible Ring Wraiths. I thought ghosts were bound to one specific place barring special circumstances, Nick asked confused. Helena rolled her eyes. The 4-house ghost of Hogwarts are part of that set of special circumstances. Besides, ghosts can go anywhere they had been when they were alive freely, she said with a smirk. Enough about me, let's talk about you. There has been oh so many rumors about you going around the school. How many are true? She asked eagerly as she shifted in mid-air to a different position. Nick shrugged. I don't listen to rumors, so I have no clue, he said honestly. This back and forth conversation continued for a couple hours before Madame Pomfrey kicked both of them out of the infirmary since Nick had already recovered. Nick had calmed down thanks to Helena's company, but this didn't mean he wasn't going to get back at Dumbledore for his actions. He knew exactly what would be perfect for this as well, since it would strike the man where it hurt the most, his reputation. Nick went to his workshop with Helena following right along because as a ghost she has literally nothing better to do besides haunt him. Something interesting happened however while she was messing around trying to grab his tools, as she actually picked one of them up. This caused both her and him to freeze in disbelief before she cackled like a madwoman and swung the tool she picked up around eagerly. This tool was the hammer Nick had gotten from the roulette. He realized it might be because of its astral nature that Helena could wield it, as it left her spiritual self not phase through it. This reminded Nick an awful lot of the cursed beings that the Celebrimbor-style rings could potentially create, ring wraiths. The ring wraiths previously created using the style were mortals given ghostly properties like not aging and being basically immortal. The biggest downside to the state however was the fact that ring wraiths were slaves to Sauron and could not be satisfied by food or drink. In theory there was nothing stopping Nick from making a ring that turned ghost like Helena into ring wraiths of a sort. Obviously there was no Sauron in this world to control and corrupt them, but Nick doubted any ghost wouldn't give fealty willingly to him if he gave them physical forms again. Nick's eyes widened however, as he had a most terrible idea that may or may not work, but if it did he would be untouchable. You see, if he created a corrupting ring like Sauron's did for the ring wraiths, he could accidentally let it slip what it does to ghost and then leave it for Voldemort accidentally take and use. While the guy might go on a bit of a rampage for a while, eventually the ring's influence will bring him to heel as Nick's slave. Most people may not deserve slavery, but Voldemort was pretty much magical Hitler, so Nick didn't think anyone would really care. Damn it! I forgot about the Horcruxes for a moment. Nick cursed mentally as he realized that so long as the connection between Voldemort and his soul fragments existed, the ring's corruption would be cleansed before it could take hold. Well, that plan was shot down immediately. Still, an elite group of ring wraiths would be useful. Nick thought seriously. Could you come here for a moment? I want to test something, he said, and Helena stopped swinging around the hammer like a lunatic but refused to drop the thing. Still she floated over and Nick locked the door to the workshop, which confused her. What you are about to see and maybe experience does not leave this room, Nick said very seriously, and while confused about the secrecy she agreed. Nick began to channel his spiritual energy into his arms and the room lit up with a white glow. Nick then reached out and grabbed Helena's hand with his glowing hand. She shivered on contact like a chill suddenly went past her as she for the first time in over 1,000 years felt the warmth of someone else's touch. She dropped the hammer and grabbed hold of Nick's glowing hand with an excited and curious expression with both hands. How are you doing this? She exclaimed, eager to know more. Once again, this does not leave this room under any circumstances. Nick made sure she understood the seriousness of this. Helena had a serious expression as she swore it with an unbreakable oath, much to Nick's surprise. Well, that simplifies things a bit, Nick said before explaining how he enchanted stuff by channeling his spiritual energy into the rings, and that this test was to see if he could physically touch a ghost using the same method. Chapter 104, Sweet Revenge. Helena was fascinated by the principles behind Nick's crafting style and even said it was the perfect thing for a Ravenclaw, as the more you know and understand the more powerful your enchantment. She did warn Nick heavily however that he probably should be very careful with using his spiritual energy, as soul-based magics were the most unknown kind. Nick found this rather ironic, considering thanks to the crafting style he already had a very decent understanding of souls. Not like masterful levels of understanding mind, but a solid foot in the door of the subject. Nick transfigured himself a chair and a clipboard after they were done talking, as he needed to get started on his revenge against Dumbledore. His plan was very simple really, as he simply planned to air out some of Dumbledore's dirty past. Simple but horrible things like his relationship to Grindelwald and how he left Harry in a Muggle family that abused him, as well as the heavily implied threat the man stated at the beginning of the year feast. To top it off, Nick even added in his most recent stunt and the terrible implication behind it as well. Every dirty secret Nick could remember about the man went into this letter and ended up taking close to 4 whole sheets of parchment paper to finish. He then went to the Olori and placed the letter in an envelope that he then addressed to one Rita Skeeter, with it wax sealed with the Ravenclaw signet ring. Unless the woman had suddenly decided to change her slanderous nature and no longer wanted to be a journalist, Nick was sure she would leap at this chance eagerly. Dumbledore could expect some serious backlash from the wizarding community once his sins were aired for everyone to see. While it was doubtful that the man would take any real punishment for his actions, his reputation will take a sharp and painful hit. Nick had thought about enlisting the old goat's help in freeing Sirius from prison, but the man had cut that idea down with this last stunt. All of the owls were eager to do Nick's bidding, and he ended up choosing an eye-catching great horned owl that just so happened to belong to McGonagall for the task. It was hard to ignore a bird that size trying to get your attention after all. The moment the owl flew away with the letter in its grasp, Nick visibly relaxed, as he had officially gotten his vengeance and now merely needed to wait and watch. He had skipped lunch and got knocked out before eating his fill at breakfast, so he was understandably hungry. Returning to the workshop, Nick got comfortable and ate some lembas bread since he planned to skip dinner as well. While he may be calm at the moment, he was aware that he may do something to tip the old bastard off that he had done something if a confrontation happened. He would much prefer simply biding his time until breakfast tomorrow when the newspaper came in. Nick could only shake his head at Helena waving around the hammer like a lunatic with a wide smile. He didn't mind her holding the thing since it was useless to anyone who wasn't him, thanks to the fact that unless specified otherwise, anything he gets from the system was bound to him exclusively. Stealing it was impossible, since the moment someone tried it would simply vanish and appear in his inventory, which was basically just greed. The rest of the evening Nick simply laid back and relaxed in his workshop while reading the books on rituals. Helena was quite surprised to see him reading the book since it was in a lost language. But since her unbreakable vow made her unable to reveal what she learned in the workshop, he came clean about his ability to speak and read any language. She looked jealous of him and stated that that particular magical gift came from a certain Middle Eastern wizarding family. It would seem somewhere in the last 1,000 years Nick's ancestors had mixed with that family before leaving it again. He simply wouldn't be Caucasian otherwise, as most Middle Eastern families had dark skin and he had tan if a bit pale skin. Helena had a theory that her mother had taken Nick's ancestor to the Middle East and it had simply been a matter of coincidence that led Nick to being in Hogwarts teaching purview. Nick assumed that there was probably more to the story but decided to keep that to himself as he went back to his book. Helena looked at the title of the book but didn't seem to care about it, likely since she had read it already. Chapter 105, Sweet Revenge, 2. Nick finished his current book in this time but wasn't terribly impressed with any of the remaining rituals he found. Most of them had effects he could gain from simply making a ring, while others were borderline dark magic and were unappealing to him as a result. The reason Nick didn't just enchant a ring to do the things that his list of rituals did was simply because he either didn't know how they did so or it was simply a waste to do so. Why make a ring to see in the dark when a short ritual later and you can do the same thing without the possibility of someone stealing it? It wasn't exactly a hard concept to grasp, all things considered, and while collecting the ingredients for the ritual seemed tedious, it was a small price to pay. Nick turned into bed at 8 o'clock so that he was already long asleep by the time his housemates realized he was in the dorm. He wasn't surprised to see a certain elf in his dreams once he drifted off to sleep. I will not judge you for your anger, as it was justified, but that woman was correct in that you mustn't let it control you. It is easy to cause our emotions to bleed over into our work as we channel our spirits. He said seriously. I know, it's one of the reasons I took my revenge so quickly rather than making the man suffer for his actions. Nick said with a sigh. Letting his anger fester and grow may simply cause all of his creations until he gets rid of it to be violent and dangerous. Nick couldn't afford such a thing, as it would immediately end up with him shipped off to Azkaban for creating dark magical items should any of them get out. The elf nodded. I know what you fear and you are correct to think so. Wrathful enchantments have always been seen in a terrible light, even in my own world. He said honestly. I have been made aware of your idea involving ring wraiths. The elf said the last two words with a hateful expression. Thankfully what you have thought to accomplish is not the same as the abominations from my own world. Rather, it appears to be much like a trade, and a fair one at that, as in exchange for fealty they gain physical forms once again. He said with an impressed look. It is a good plan, and this world has a plethora of old and powerful ghosts who would no doubt be willing to accept this deal. Nick said with a wide grin. Indeed, I take it your distant relative is the first you aim to have on your side? The elf asked with a knowing look. I would be lying if I said the idea hadn't crossed my mind, but I will not be the one to extend that deal to her. She will need to ask it on her own accord instead, to emphasize impartiality. Nick said seriously. The elf fell into thought for a moment before nodding his head in agreement. That will indeed show that you are fair in your dealings, and I assume a failsafe on the rings will be in order as well? He asked calmly. Nick nodded. I would like to do so, but I am rather at a loss as to how I might do so. He said honestly. Since you do not seek to enslave them, the method from my world is not an option, perhaps a mix between motive detection and self-destruction. The elf suggested helpfully. Nick and the elf passed ideas back and forth for a while before the dream ended and Nick woke up. He would be lying if he said he wasn't eager to see the look on the old man's face when he reads the paper. In fact, Nick was practically bouncing in place out of excitement at the prospect for an entire hour until breakfast finally came around. He got a lot of strange looks and murmurs when he sat at the table that had been repaired. Ron and Harry tried to talk to him about what had happened, but he merely smiled mischievously and told them to wait. Dumbledore had a very bad feeling when he saw the look on Nick's face, but wasn't aware what the boy had done. This changed when the owls arrived and he read the front cover of the Daily Prophet. Dumbledore the Terrible. Full story below. The more he read, the paler he went, as dark deed after dark deed of his was written clearly and concisely on the paper. He looked up from the paper at the boy and saw him mouth the words "Karma's a bitch" before cackling loudly. Chapter 106, Reactions. It was clear to the entire school where the source of the information in the paper came from, as Nick reveled in the look of disbelief on Dumbledore's face. The professors all had varying expressions at the situation, from disbelief to amusement. Snape actually seemed slightly proud of this absolutely vicious retaliation on Nick's part. He, better than most, was aware of the terrible things the old man had done for the greater good, and had a bit of frustration build up at the lack of punishment the man seemed to get for it. McGonagall was in disbelief at the information found in the paper that shed a falsehood she had been living with for a long time. Her longtime friend wasn't some paragon of all that was good in the world but just a flawed man who would do whatever it took to achieve his goals. She had been in denial about the things she had seen the man do over the years since he always said it was for the greater good, but the things in this paper were simply dreadful. The worst in her opinion was Harry himself, as she always assumed that he was well taken care of but now knew the truth. Flitwick was enraged to see the things written in the paper, as unlike the other professors he had never involved himself in the going-ons of the world past the paper and so only had the gossip of students and personal interactions with others to go off from. Before now he had assumed Dumbledore to be a stanch supporter of the light and had a strict moral code he adhered to. Clearly, though this was all wrong, as from Albus's reaction the things written in the paper were all true, this led to the question of how Nick uncovered all of this. However, Dumbledore knew that with the right kind of digging quite a few of these pieces of information could be verified, however others were of an extremely personal level with no more than 3 people at most knowing them. He immediately figured out what the most possible option was, however, and felt dread at the idea. It was back when he first noticed the boy and went to read his memories but was struck with a vicious counterattack. The possibility existed that the boy had gotten a glimpse of his most secret memories through that brief mental clash but had kept them to himself until now. By violating the boy's privacy he in turn forfeited the right to have his own maintained, and he could understand this. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one he had prepared himself for the moment he acted as he did. Dumbledore wouldn't deny that this truly was a painful blow to his person and might be one he would never recover from, but the same could be said of what he did to Nick, and so he considered them even. Nick was in a fantastic mood after the announcement in the papers came out and Dumbledore got a taste of his just desserts. "How do you know all of this, mate?" Ron asked curiously, since it was clear Nick had been the one to tip off the press. "That I will keep to myself, though I will say that if you look closely to the records of the past, proof of what is written there can be found," Nick said with a wide smile. "After what he did to you, I'd say he deserves this," one of the twins said honestly from nearby on the table, and most of the table nodded in agreement. After breakfast was over, Nick made sure to get the twins' help to head into the Forbidden Forest without getting caught. "Now why would a ickle firstie like yourself need to go there?" one of them asked with an amused expression. "Quite hard to believe it is, dearest brother of mine," the other said with the same expression. "I need something not exactly easily obtained for a project of mine that can be found there. So will you help me or not?" Nick said impatiently. "Don't get your knickers in a twist, mate, we'll help you," one of them said before they both broke out into wide smiles. "For a price, of course," they both said at the same time. Nick shrugged and removed 10 golden coins from greed. "I assume this'll suffice," he said neutrally. Nick may be a greedy individual, but that was only because money gets things done, and with enough money few things are truly a problem. As a result, if he can simply part with a sum of money for a much more valuable service, he had no problem at all doing so. Chapter 107, Hunting. "That'll do nicely, yes," one of the twins said as they snatched up the coins eagerly. "I've done my part, now it's both of yours," Nick said. "All business. Not to worry, mate, we haven't let you down so far and we've no plans to start now. Follow us," the other twin said with a grin, and they left quickly. "We'll need to keep an eye out for Professor Sprout, but otherwise it should be a cinch to get you safely in the forest after that, though you're on your own, since even we need to be careful in there," one of the explained seriously as they made their way to the greenhouses of all places. Specifically the 4th greenhouse that, after verifying, was empty, they entered carefully while Nick mimicked the twins' actions to not disturb anything inside it. As it turned out, there was a secret passage to the Forbidden Forest hidden under a pile of empty planters' pots at the back of the greenhouse. "I can honestly say that I'd never have found this without someone pointing it out," Nick thought, impressed that the twins had found it. "We normally use this to collect stuff for our products or to earn a bit of coin for the same purpose," one of the twins said as they pushed open the trapdoor that revealed itself to be hidden between the roots of one of the tall trees of the forest. "This is where we part ways, mate, best of luck," the other twin said before they went back into the underground tunnel. "Already, so first and foremost I need to mark this tree so I can find it again later," Nick thought before waving his wand at a stick on the ground, turning it into a flag that he then hung from one of the tree's branches. Besides that, he also memorized the tree's appearance just in case something takes the flag down. Nick noticed how dark the forest was and was glad that he had completed that ritual before he came here, as most of the sunlight was blocked by the thick overhead foliage. He kept his wand in his hand at the ready as he began to walk further into the forest while keeping an eye on the area above him as well as on the shadows of the tree roots. Even the smallest acromantula was the size of a cat, and much like most other spider species they were very good at hiding. As a result, Nick needed to keep his eyes peeled for even the smallest abnormality. Clearly he was worried for no reason, as out from the trees ahead of him a large horse with pearl white skin and a silver mane walked out into the open. The most distinguishing feature of the creature, however, was the long spiral ivory horn on its forehead. It was a unicorn. Acromantulas would never be found anywhere near a unicorn, as their nature heavily clashed, since unicorns were creatures of purity and innocence. The giant spiders, on the other hand, were dark and evil creatures that couldn't stand the presence of something like a unicorn. It was for this reason that Nick relaxed when the unicorn made itself known. That's right, the unicorn willingly showed itself, as Nick would have never known it was there otherwise. Nick bowed to the unicorn respectfully but not submissively, and the creature returned the bow like one ruler greeting another. "If it's not too much trouble, could you point me in the direction of the nearest member of that spider colony?" Nick asked politely. The unicorn seemed surprised to hear this and paused for a moment before nodding its head slightly and pointed in a certain direction with its horn. "Thank you," Nick said, and the unicorn walked off, leaving him alone again. Following the direction that the unicorn had pointed out carefully, Nick soon started to see signs of acromantula activity in the form of the occasional web. He didn't dare to go further into this area, however, as entering a colony of the things is a death sentence in most cases, and his certainly counted. Thankfully he didn't need to go deeper, as he immediately noticed a figure slowly but surely creeping towards him from the top of a nearby tree. Acting like he didn't notice it, Nick turned to walk away, and the figure paused for a moment as if conflicted about whether to follow him away from the colony's territory. But it seemed that greed and hunger won out over logic, as it still did so. Nick didn't walk fast, but he still managed to gain quite some distance from the colony's territory before he launched a sudden surprise attack on the figure stalking him. Chapter 108, Hunting and Profit. Agled. He spoke firmly, and an arm-thick bolt of electricity flew forth from the tip and struck the figure, all while ever so briefly illuminating its true appearance. It was a creature similar in appearance to that of a brown huntsman spider, but the size of an adult man. The acromantula hissed in pain and seized up, causing it to fall to the ground with a loud thud, but was clearly still alive. Nick hit it with another heavy dose of electricity, followed by another and another, before finally the thing appeared to die and curled up like normal spiders did after death. Nick was a firm believer in not taking gambles with his life, however, and with a wave of his wand transfigured thick metal chains out of the forest soil that tightly wrapped around the limbs of the acromantula. This proved wise, as the spider immediately started to struggle in an attempt to break free after realizing that its trick failed horribly. Nick scoffed at the beast's struggle, as the chains he transfigured were made of tungsten and thus damn near impossible to brute force your way out of. Nick calmly pointed his wand at the monster and spoke but a single word 6 times in rapid succession, truly killing it. After that he stored the entire corpse minus the legs in greed before quickly but carefully making his way back to the secret passage back to the school. The flag was still attached to the tree, so after cancelling it he opened the hatch and officially ended his first trip into the Forbidden Forest. Unfortunately, this hunt of his didn't go unnoticed by the centaurs living in the forest, and the legs Nick had left behind were discovered by them. They decided to drop the matter there, however, since it was clear that whoever was in the forest was hunting acromantulas, and the centaurs hated those spiders with a passion. In this particular case it was a simple matter of the trespassers' goal suiting their purpose, so they turned a blind eye to the broken rules. Nick wasn't aware of this, and even if he was, it made no difference, since in the end it would change literally nothing, besides maybe that he would use it to get closer to them in the future. After checking to make sure that Professor Sprout wasn't nearby, Nick left the greenhouse and re-entered the castle. Another careful journey through the castle and he made it to the roar and got a room set up specifically meant to be used to harvest the spider's parts. He had to be very careful when removing the organs, or all of his hard work would be rendered pointless. First he used the tools provided by the room to remove the fangs and poison sacs. Then he used a special curved blade tool to separate the carapace of the body into 2 pieces without damaging the organs inside. Nick carefully pulled the top of the carapace away from the bottom while carefully making sure that no organs were stuck to it, and then set it aside. Then he started to slowly but methodically separate the organs from each other without bursting any of them. He stored the heart away in a special preservative potion before having the room conjure up a list of all the useful parts that he had left and preserving those as well. The final part was the silk-producing organ and spinneret meant to use it. For this he used transfiguration to weave the fluid into a thin but strong non-sticky thread, which he then stored in greed. This single spider gave him a single large spool of silk, which wasn't enough to make a set of clothes but would certainly be perfect for fastenings or decorations. Nick directly incinerated the remaining parts of the spider that served no purpose for him before leaving the room and heading for the Great Hall after a quick tempest charm told him lunch was soon. He didn't take any shortcuts in order to kill the last little bit of time before lunch and entered the Great Hall with a pleasant smile on his face, since he was in a good mood. Harry and Ron greeted him as he sat down to eat, and he returned the greeting happily. "What's got you so cheerful?" Ron asked curiously. "I've just been having a good day is all," Nick said honestly. If you say so, still got any plans for the rest of the weekend? He asked calmly while stabbing a sausage with his fork. Got a bit of research I need to do, but other than that I'm totally free, Nick said while grabbing a couple finger sandwiches. Chapter 109, Grindelwald. What sort of research? Ron asked curiously. Mind arts, occlumency, legilimency, confundus, stupefy and obliviate, that sort of thing. I suppose it should go without saying, but the blood used to discern my heritage wasn't given freely, and I'd like to prevent similar incidents, Nick said while making sure to keep his anger in check. He may have vented out his wrath with his revenge, but that didn't make talking about the topic a calm affair. That was a right foul thing to do on the headmaster's part, Ron said seriously. No one found Nick's interest in the mind arts unusual, considering the method Dumbledore used was pretty obvious. Meanwhile, in the Austrian mountains, a single half-destroyed castle stood almost seeming to be abandoned, but the truth was far different. Dozens of powerful wards covered the area, and an entire 5-man squad of elite Aurors patrolled it seriously at all times. Despite this, however, there was only a single person who resided within the castle's walls. An old man with heterochrome eyes and short, neatly combed hair that failed to match the wild long beard that covered his lower face. The old man had narrow but not quite skeletal features and a sort of peaceful smile on his face at all times. If Nick was here, he would notice that despite the room the man was living in appearing comfortable, not a single thing other than the man himself was magical. This didn't seem to bother the man, however, as he merely waved a narrow finger and the spoon in his teacup stirred its contents gently before coming out and landing neatly on the napkin next to the cup. Soon one of the Aurors walked into the room stone-faced and carelessly tossed a copy of the Daily Prophet at the old man before leaving without a word. The paper struck the old friend harshly, but his expression didn't change at all, as if he was used to such behavior by now. Looking at the headline of the paper, the man quirked an eyebrow in interest before reading the article curiously. Once he was done, the smile on his face widened and he chuckled, a dry and raspy sound due to not having spoken for a long period of time. It seems you've angered a rather resourceful little fellow, my old friend. How interesting. The man spoke to no one, but his dry raspy voice still seemed to linger in the air. Perhaps I might pay this young man a visit, after all I am ever so bored at the moment and he seems rather amusing. The man mused out loud before laughing uproariously. The Aurors heard the man's laughter from outside the castle, and one of them asked frustrated, why don't they just kill the monster rather than keep him locked up here where he might escape? The Auror leading the squad sighed, hearing his teammate's question. It's not that they don't want to kill him, but rather that they can't, since even with all these restrictions he is still powerful enough to kill all of us easily. He explained seriously. It is only due to a deal that Grindelwald has with Dumbledore that the man even sits here quietly without any trouble. The leader says darkly. Then why are we needed? The other Auror asked angrily. We are not here to make sure that Grindelwald doesn't escape, but to warn the rest of the world if he does. The leader says sternly, and the entire squad has dark expressions hearing it but doesn't argue. Then I suggest you be on your way then, unless you would rather waste your time here, that is. An old raspy voice says calmly, and all of the Aurors look to the source of the voice in fear. There outside the castle's only entrance or exit stood the old man with that same smile on his face. The squad of Aurors all point their wands at the man shakily but with conviction. Grindelwald. Return to the castle at once or prepare to face the consequences. The leader yells sternly, even though he is clearly afraid. No, I don't think I will, thank you, Grindelwald said before slowly fading away like a mirage, and the Aurors grew pale. With a heavy heart, the leader takes a magical device out of his pocket that looked like a fragile crystal orb and tossed it on the ground, shattering it. In the office of the Austrian Minister of Magic, a middle-aged heavy-set woman with brown hair and eyes froze in shock as the sound of a crystal shattering filled her office. Her hopes of it being an illusion were dashed as she turned to look at a particular place in her office and saw that a certain fail-safe device had been activated, and she knew Grindelwald was free. Chapter 110, Global Panic and Friends. Dumbledore was in his office dealing with the aftermath of Nick's retaliation with a tired expression, while Fawkes seemed to gloat at his misery. He couldn't blame his familiar, as he had been all but told by the magical bird not to take the path he did, but he had thought himself beyond reproach and was now paying for it. Letters from the ministry, concerned parents, and just all-around angry wizards piled up on his desk haphazardly as more and more came in. The worst part in his opinion, however, was that his longtime friends and supporters had been deeply hurt from learning the truth of his past sins. He knew he wasn't a good man by any means, but he always thought about the future of wizarding kind when he did anything. While this reprisal stung considerably right now, Dumbledore knew that so long as he allowed time to work its magic and he stayed on the straight and narrow, he would recover from it just fine. This changed however when a single letter showed up on top of the pile of letters that had an eye-catching and unmissable crimson envelope and gold ministry seal that he was oh so very familiar with. Even Fawkes grew taciturn when it saw the letter and dropped all extraneous thoughts to focus on the letter. Dumbledore's heart beat loudly in his chest as he reached for the envelope and nervously opened it with a letter opener to reveal a similarly colored letter with 4 words written on it in large black lettering: Grindelwald has escaped Nermengard. Dumbledore took a deep breath to steady himself and shared a look with Fawkes. He is free, he said quietly, and the proud bird grew stern and serious as its feather flickered with fire. Similar reactions were being had all across the world as the magical side of the world was informed of the escape of an incredibly dangerous Dark Lord. Panic was beginning to spread through the world as the shadow of a foe thought long defeated reared its head once again. Meanwhile Nick was totally unaware of what his actions had unleashed upon the world with his revenge, but he will soon. He sat at the table and ate his food casually while chatting with a couple of his friends about what they should do for the rest of the weekend. Nick was all but tackled by Tracy after lunch as she repeatedly made sure that he was all right and that Dumbledore hadn't tried to retaliate for his retaliation. Nick gently peeled the girl off of him with a sigh in an impressive show of strength. "I'm fine, Tracy, I already have something in mind to ensure that this doesn't happen again," Nick said reassuringly. He then explained how he was going to research the mind arts before creating a ring to protect him from them, or at least give him enough time to protect himself. "Would that even work?" "Not that I think you are lying or anything, but that sounds really powerful and we are only first years," Tracy said doubtfully. "I admit that I may need to overdraft myself a little to make a decent version of the ring, but I can't stand the thought of something like this happening again," Nick said seriously. "Don't try to shoulder all the burden, you have friends who can help," Daphne interjected sternly, causing everyone to look at her in surprise. She gained a hint of red in her cheeks at their gazes and looks away embarrassed. "She's right, mate, we have your back if you need it," Harry said honestly, and Ron agreed. Nick was honestly and truly touched at the sentiment, but he also felt bad because of his future plans involving them. He decided to scrap those plans after hearing this and began to make new ones that will definitely fuck with the canon timeline irreversibly. "First things first though, I need to protect my mind," he thought seriously. "I promise not to try and take on the world alone, they're happy?" he asked with a smirk. Harry also had a smirk on his face. "It'll do for now, I suppose," he said jokingly. "Now that that's out of the way, Ravenclaw, hey?" Tracy said teasingly, and Nick groaned. Yes, get it all out of your system now," Nick said sarcastically. "Come on, you are practically royalty with a bloodline like that. You should have seen the look on Draco's face when the news was announced. He turned the same shade as his robes," Tracy said excitedly. "I'm sure that was quite a sight indeed. Sadly I was unconscious thanks to your head of house," Nick said regretfully. He didn't blame Snape at all and was even a little thankful to the man from stopping him from ruining his future. Chapter 111, Mind Arts. Nick hung out with his friends for another couple hours before heading to the library to find as much information on the mind arts as he could. A few people noticed him in the hallways and the library itself and whispered amongst themselves. Nick ignored them however as he was hyper-focused on his goal. He quickly began scouring the bookshelves starting from the first and making his way back. He didn't expect to find any information on legilimency, occlumency, or obliviate in the normal area of the library, but both stupefy and confuse should be available. He was correct in this thought, as well as he found 2 tomes with information on the spells and their effects. In a surprising turn of events, Nick also found a book on occlumency as well, hidden behind a series of tomes on warts and toads. Satisfied with his finds, Nick found a table in the ancient section out of sight before he started to hungrily devour the information in them. The stupefy charm was sort of similar to getting punched in effect, as it was simply meant to overload the mind with sensory information, making it basically restart itself. The confuse charm, however, was where things got interesting. What it did was stop the mind from creating any new memories while leaving the receiver unaware of their surroundings. Nick had an ugly expression when he saw this information, as it fit perfectly with his memories of a certain moment recently that he seemed to lose a few moments of time. Thankfully the spell could be blocked with occlumency shields according to the book. Nick ignored the rest of those 2 books as it was merely information on attacking spells and his time was limited at the moment, leaving him unwilling to waste it learning spells he didn't need. The occlumency book was both helpful and not at the same time, due to the fact it did explain how to get started in the art but was needlessly vague beyond that. Still, Nick grit his teeth and spent the rest of the day deciphering what was basically the ravings of a demented mind. While it was clear that the author knew his stuff, it was equally clear that they wanted to make it as hard as possible for the reader to understand said knowledge. Nick wasn't sure why they would do such a thing, but could only shrug and chalk it up to wizards being weird. Still, at the cost of skipping dinner, Nick finally had a fairly decent base by which he could work with for further research into the mind arts. There was no visit from the elf this night and Nick slept peacefully. Waking up at dawn on Sunday, Nick stretched and yawned before sitting on his bed and clearing his mind like the Book of Occlumency said to, and began to imagine his magic entering his mind like a fog. This part supposedly took the longest amount of time to achieve, but since Nick could directly control his magic to a degree, he accomplished it easily. The next part, however, was the most tricky as it was totally different depending on who did it. This was the mindscape phase of occlumency that involved creating a personal representation of your perfect environment in your mind using the magic gathered there. The reason this was tricky in that there was no actually way to know what that actually was until you succeeded. This meant that you had to try over and over again until you succeeded before you could even begin to think about building defenses. Nick was clearly not very lucky, as even with deep introspection on his personality and habits he failed instantly 5 different times. Volcano, nope. Library, nope. Forge, nope, over and over again with no signs of even getting close to finding the correct scenery. After an hour of constant failure, Nick could only sigh and open his eyes as Ron and Harry had begun to stir awake. Despite using occlumency herself, Nick couldn't ask Daphne for advice since everyone's mindscape was totally different. Still, he wasn't bothered by this setback as he was willing to put in the work for what he wanted. Nick went straight for the library after breakfast and began to dig through the ancient section of the library and could help but crack a wide grin at what he found. 6 whole books on both legilimency and occlumency, as well as 4 books that cover only a single subject at a time. 10 books on the mind arts was an exceptionally rich amount considering how rare the information was. It came as little surprise to find that 2 of those books were authored by none other than Salazar Slytherin himself, since he was a notoriously well-versed individual in all aspects of healing. Chapter 112, Legilimency. Salazar Slytherin's books were amongst those that covered both sides of the mind arts, which meant that they could likely be used to heal others if properly utilized. Nick started reading one of these books and was quickly drawn into the startlingly well-documented information written within. He learned from the book that in fact both occlumency and legilimency were in fact once the same subject but had been later split into 2 subjects based on what they could accomplish. Legilimency was the magic of reading and manipulating the mind of others gently. It was a delicate and masterful art that required utmost control. Only amateurs or those not caring for the mental well-being of others would brute force their way into the minds of those around them, and Slytherin showed a clear level of detest for such individuals. Occlumency, on the flip side, was the magic of controlling and protecting one's own mind and was therefore much more forgiving on failures. Slytherin made it clear in his explanation of the subject that he believed that all wizards should have at least a basic foundation in both sides of the mind arts. The book stated roughly the same information in regards to starting out in occlumency as the previous book Nick read, but with clearer details. The book also recommended learning and gaining proficiency in legilimency before attempting to build one's shields, as it was easier once you were personally aware of the way you could be attacked. To learn legilimency on the most basic level, one needed to understand which form they were attempting to learn, as there was in fact 2 variations of the subject, each with their own pros and cons. The first kind was silent legilimency, which was the one involving eye contact but no verbal spell component. This form needed the caster to learn how to both cast spells without a wand as well as how to project mental tendrils from one's eyes. This is the reason this form was usually considered a state that only masters of the other form were capable of, when in fact it could be learned on its own without the other form at all. The pros were fairly obvious, as it was silent, difficult to detect if not being attacked, and fairly easily initiated. The cons, however, were that it was much weaker than the other form, it was easier to defend against, and it also left one open to retaliation due to the concentration needed. The second form was the one that the art was named from, legilimens, and involved using the spell with one's wand as a medium to enter the target's mind. The pros were the stability, strength, and precision afforded by using one's wand to focus their magic. The cons were that anyone in earshot will know what you're doing, it's illegal to use the spell on a person without permission, and it is more draining on the caster's mental strength due to being funneled through the wand. Slytherin went to great lengths to emphasize the benefits that learning the art could have, from helping mental illness to making muggles ignore something they shouldn't have seen. As it turns out, the Obliviate spell was actually created based on this ability of legilimens for wizards who are either unskilled in the mind arts or in a rush. The way the spell worked was by flat out removing the memory from the part of the mind that remembers stuff, effectively wiping it away. A skilled user of the spell may even do it in such a way that the target doesn't even realize that those memories were gone. The Confundus spell, on the other hand, simply prevents the mind from forming new memories, making it perfect for things like entering restricted areas that have guards. Slytherin goes into great detail about how a novice should go about training the 2 forms step by step. To start off with, one needs to get used to controlling one's mental energy, and the best target for this according to Slytherin is a simple insect such as a fly or normal beetle. After that, the goal should be to move to larger and more powerful creatures such as rats, cats and dogs. According to Slytherin, a novice legilimens should never fall into the trap that is human experimentation with the arts, not only due to the danger it poses to the victim but also because the fast progress it brings is in exchange for the art's true potential. By never using the art on a person but moving on to magical creatures instead, the final potential exceeds the human path, as one could use the art even on the mightiest of creatures such as dragons. Chapter 113, Healing Mind Arts. Nick could help but appreciate the obvious dedication to teaching that Slytherin seemed to have, as it was clear he held nothing back when writing this book. Knowing this, he shamelessly stole it to add to his personal collection of books since he could appreciate what was held within. Honestly speaking, Nick wanted to add the entire ancient section to his personal collection, but unfortunately such a massive loss in literature was bound to be noticed quickly. Instead, Nick simply limited the books he took to the real gems that lay hidden within it. Despite being so comprehensive, Nick needed an hour to memorize the entire book due to how clear and simply Slytherin wrote the information. Eagerly, Nick moved on to the next book written by the Great Wizard and was delighted to find that they were actually a set. This book was written with the previous book in mind, as it went into the more advanced use of both legilimency and occlumency. The clear emphasis on the art of healing a broken mind, however, was the main topic of the book and covered close to half the entire tome. Slytherin had included nearly every possible reason for mind damage as well as how to fix it. The topic had some dark undertones in some parts, however, as Slytherin seemed to speak of personally torturing someone to insanity before repairing their mind. Nick could understand how people may assume the ancient wizard was dark after reading such a thing, but could also tell that the man was likely just brutally efficient instead. Dark wizards are those who delved into the dark arts and lost themselves along the way, while from his writings Nick could see that the man dove into the dark arts in order to help the true victims of it. Nick felt it a pity that clearly none of this information was known, as it may help those driven to insanity in the previous Wizarding War via the Cruciatus Curse. The other half of the book held the advanced tiers of the mind arts, and Nick simply went over the information to commit it to memory, even if it was useless to him at this point. He could only sigh, however, when he went to the other tomes he had found and discovered that they almost only covered the stuff that the Slytherin books did, but in a much more long-winded and convoluted manner. Nick ended simply skimming through those books since he was mostly getting redundant information. In the end, he went through all of those books and only got a handful of additional useful information on the mind arts that wasn't covered by the Slytherin books. This left Nick with around 4 hours until dinner, so he stored away the second Slytherin book for his personal collection before putting the other books back on the shelf and leaving the library. While maintaining his magical senses to make sure he wasn't tricked again, Nick made his way to his workshop, where he wasn't surprised to find Helena playing with the hammer. "Good evening," the ghost said casually as he walked in before going back to messing with the hammer. Nick politely returned the greeting before sitting against the wall cross-legged and closed his eyes to try and form his mindscape again. While he still failed in all of his attempts, he was beginning to narrow it down, as some of his choices lasted slightly longer than others. So he experimented about exactly what facet of them it was that was correct before moving on to other things with the facet added on. By the end of these 4 hours he had discovered 3 facets that remained constant between each iteration: the small pond of water, the body-length mirror and the stars overhead. Slytherin's book did say that one's mindscape was in theory infinite, so Nick wasn't surprised that something like the starry sky without the moon was part of his. What did surprise him, however, was that neither the sun or moon were accepted by his mindscape. Still, despite not making much real progress, Nick was happy with what he had found so far and went to the Great Hall in a good mood, but still careful about ambushes. Dumbledore spoke on this evening, however, and despite Nick's distaste of the man, what he said had Nick put aside any grudge he had. "Students, it with a heavy heart that I must inform you of grave news. Earlier this very day the Dark Lord Grindelwald has escaped from his prison in Nurmengard Castle." The Great Hall broke into uproar at this information, and Nick noted that Quirrell Elmore did not look happy at the news. "I recommend writing to your families as soon as possible so they may prepare for whatever may come of this information, and that if possible you all chip in to help those who would fight the Dark Lord." That last part was clearly directed at Nick, as the man looked right at him and bowed his head, the meaning of which was perfectly clear. Chapter 114, Intense Preparations. Whatever enmity the two of them had between each other needed to be put on the back burner, while a threat to both of them like Grindelwald was free. Nick might really dislike the old wizard, but even he knew how bad any sort of internal conflict would be at the moment. Nick merely stared the old man down before mouthing the words "Leave me alone" and turning away. Dumbledore sighed in relief, as Nick had basically just told him that so long as he wasn't dragged into it by him he would ignore his existence. This was not the optimal outcome, but considering how much he had wronged the boy, Dumbledore considered it perfectly acceptable. Nick meanwhile knew that he needed to increase his power considerably now. This didn't mean not further solidifying his foundation but rather starting to build on it as well. While his lightning spell was powerful, it was also easily blocked or dodged as it was very much straightforward in its attack angle. Most spells also fell into this category, but there were exceptions. For example, the killing curse couldn't be blocked by any spell and needed a physical barrier to block it. The best defense against the curse was transfiguration, but due to the difficulty of using the art in combat, most simply opted for dodging instead. What Nick had in mind, however, would very much count as a war crime, as he wanted to modify the smokescreen charm to create poisonous gas instead of normal smoke, like mustard gas. This was definitely chemical warfare and in Muggle law would get him arrested immediately. The wizarding word, however, didn't have such problems, as the law for self-modified spells was that a ruling had to be made against the spell before it could be banned. This meant that unless he used the spell again after it was banned, he could get away with casting it scot-free. At most he would be labeled as someone dabbling in dark magic after the ruling, if any ruling was made at all. Even better was that Nick had a very large list of spells that he could modify in some way to make them combat viable. Nick didn't doubt that with the right effort throughout the rest of this year he could at the very least make a nuisance of himself to most wizards. Dinner ended and all the students headed to the dorms while worried for the future. Time passed after that, and besides the fact that astronomy had been moved to midnight on Fridays, everything proceeded as per normal. During this time Nick hadn't hung out with his friends very much as he was busy making preparations. He of course didn't just ghost them without any heads up, but had explained this to them so they were very understanding. He had crafted a rather unique piece of equipment during this time that drew a lot of attention but was easily the most powerful thing he had ever made. Ring name, Bestia Finus. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Auto-sizing, Growth, Walker Charge, Outburst, Entropic Flow. Description: an loose ankle ring comprised of smaller rings that each harmonize with the others to form a powerful defense ability. This item has no power at the beginning of its creation, but with each step the wearer takes, it stores kinetic energy that can be sacrificed all at once to slow an area of 10 meters around the wearer to a standstill. System Appraisal: a powerful single-use protective item created by an up-and-coming ring smith. This was Nick's first attempt at creating a multi-linked enchantment, and it turned out fairly well in his opinion. The ankle ring jingled with each step he took, but that was a small price to pay for what was effectively an insta-stop ability to any attack made on him. The way he created this item was by enchanting each and every individual ring with a separate incomplete portion of the total enchantment before finally liking them together to get the sum of its parts. He had also been working diligently on his mindscape for at least 1 hour each day. This paid off, as he now had a total of 12 permanent fixtures in his mindscape, and his conjured environments were lasting much longer before totally collapsing. Today was Halloween, and much like in the original story, Ron snapped at Hermione during charms class and she finally broke down. Nick was rather suspicious how such a simple thing was what kick-started the events that would follow, with Ron and Harry rescuing the girl and her mellowing out. This hadn't happened yet, but come dinner time Quire Elmore put on his whole troll in the dungeon performance and the two slipped off to find her. Chapter 115, Halloween and Chat. Nick secretly followed the two, of course, since if canon events didn't play out correctly he would step in and save them. This ended up becoming necessary, as what they found themselves confronting was so far beyond them that it wasn't even funny. Standing at 15 feet tall and looking like a tuskless humanoid elephant was the foul-scented troll, starting to get angry in the girls' restroom. Nick wasn't 100% sure, but the club it was using may in fact have been a whole tree with no branches or roots. The fact that the troll was swinging such a thing around like it was light meant that getting hit with it would likely place one's name on the obituaries the next day. While Harry and Ron proved willing to give it their all to rescue Hermione, a can-do attitude meant nothing in the face of a literal tree flying towards you fast enough to displace a large portion of air. Left with either seeing Ron get turned into a red smear or interfering, Nick quickly waved his wand and from a distance shrunk the club enough that it would just so happen to not reach Ron. No one noticed this in the heat of the moment, however, and Ron, via a moment that can only be described as plot armor, levitated the club over the troll's head before dropping it right on top of its skull. Nick was sure that the only reason the thing hadn't died was because of the frankly scary amount of durability the trolls had innately. Before he got caught by anyone, Nick quickly left the area via a nearby shortcut. It was quite the piece of gossip the next day when the story was passed around the school, since Ron couldn't seem to keep his mouth shut. Nick of course played his part as a supportive friend and didn't mention that Ron would be dead right now without his intervention. It wasn't an instant change in Hermione, but she slowly let go of some of her uptightness over the next couple days. She was still not happy with Nick, but she didn't actively seem to have an issue with him, which was good progress in his opinion. Things got quite awkward when she joined Nick's little group of friends without an invitation, but most of them simply followed Nick's lead by not minding all that much. The day after Halloween, Ron and Harry noticed Snape limping and thought that he may have had something to do with the troll the night before. That ridiculous. Why would he? Tracy said in disbelief. I'm telling you, he was fine yesterday and now he's limping about the place. It can't be a coincidence. Ron argued, sure about his idea. You have to admit it's kinda suspicious. Harry said, backing Ron up. Even Hermione looked convinced at the argument as all the facts seemed to line up. Nick decisively stayed out of it and acted like he was far more interested in the architecture than the conversation. This was of course noticed since Ron couldn't understand social cues to save his life, and he asked Nick what he thought. I think I have enough problems to worry about that occupy my thought than to be trying to gossip about everyone's most hated professor. Nick said with a shrug. Ron gaped at him for a moment before nodding his head in agreement and dropping the conversation in favor of the upcoming Quidditch game. Harry had a couple months to adjust to the game, so he was now going to be sent into his first real game in a couple days. He was rather nervous of course and hoped he wouldn't get stage fright since the whole school will be watching. You'll do great, mate, just you wait. Nick encouraged and the rest joined in, which brought a smile to the boy's face. Best part is that I know of a trick that may help you out in a pinch. Nick said with a grin. Harry tilted his head slightly in confusion. But I can't use my wand in the match, it's against the rules. He said seriously. Nick scoffed. You think I don't know that? No, the trick is a Quidditch exclusive known as a launching boom. He said, and both Tracy's and Ron's eyes grew huge. Are you trying to get him killed? Ron exclaimed in horror. What's a launching boom? Harry asked, not understanding the reference. Okay, so basically if at any point in the game you need to suddenly go much faster for a moment, you lean forward ever so slightly on your broom but not enough to actually move. Then you will feel the energy building up in the broom, and the moment you fully push the broom to actually accelerate, it will instead go extremely fast from the build-up energy. Nick explained seriously. Chapter 116, Quidditch and Mindscape. What he didn't tell you is that most people who try to use the technique end up losing control of their brooms and crashing hard. Tracy said seriously. Nick scoffed. Bah, Harry's a natural on a broom, and I'd sooner expect to see Snape in a tutu than him to lose control of his broom over something he did. Nick defended, while also secretly implying that someone will need to be attacking Harry if his broom goes postal. No one realized this but didn't argue with him about Harry's talent, as they have all seen it, though they did convince Harry to hold off on the technique until he could practice it first. Nick split off from the group after an hour or so of hanging out as per his usual habit and headed towards the workshop calmly. He had finally adjusted to the massive amount of magic in the air of Hogwarts already, so he basically never turned off his magical senses anymore at this point. He hadn't done the ritual of reflex yet due to the unforeseen problem on the end of his elven transformation. As it turned out, a small change to his physical body like with the ritual of Night Eye was fine since it didn't affect him much. The ritual of reflex, however, was problematic as it optimized his entire reactionary system in his body, and that, as it turns out, was a very big change. Nerves, muscles, and signal speed was all overhauled by the ritual, and if his physical transformation clashed with the ritual's effect, he could end up in agony at best and dead at worse. Needless to say, that was not something he was willing to risk, and had as such pushed the ritual back until his transformation was complete. Pushing the door to the workshop open, Nick saw Helena carefully painting on a canvas with his hammer that had a brush stuck to it. "Evening, Helena," he said, and she merely waved her free hand at him without looking away from her work. This development had come about as a result of her begging him repeatedly to attach a paintbrush to the hammer so she could get back into her old hobby when she was alive. Nick was skeptical of this, since it just felt odd to put a paintbrush on a hammer in his opinion, and she had dead a ghost for close to 1,000 years, so she may as well be a novice in the art of painting. He was proven wrong, however, when he actually got her some painting supplies thanks to the ever-helpful house elves. It was at this point that Nick was informed by her that the reason ghosts never go insane if they weren't already was that their minds were effectively locked in the state they were in when they died. That meant that any skills they had when they were still alive simply didn't fade away like one would expect. As a bonus though, Nick learned the spell to turn pictures into moving versions of themselves, since Helena considered her art incomplete if it was stationary. The living paintings, however, were different than the ones brought to life through this spell, thanks to the fact that the person who was painted had their memories and personality put into it. Sitting down against the wall cross-legged, he closed his eyes and began to work on his mindscape once more. He found it odd how the facets that worked had very little to do with each other, and frustrating at the same time, as he couldn't just follow a particular scheme. This time was a bit different than normal, as while he was mindlessly going through the various different things and failing back to back, one of them suddenly stuck. Nick was so caught off guard that he had almost tried to move on to the next one despite finding the correct environment. It was a strange scene as well as it made no sense at all, and he was just going through the list when he found it. The overarching theme of the entire mindscape was disorienting to say the least, as it was the very definition of chaos. Besides the facets nearby, the entire scene was a strange mix of floating islands, inverted trees growing from the sky, liquid fire that behaved like water, and slow lightning that was shifting and changing based on rules he simply couldn't understand other than the fact that it was all wrong, illogical. Nick didn't even move on to the next step of occlumency as he was too lost in whatever the fuck it was that he found himself in. Not even gravity seemed to work, as he could walk up the sides of the islands and across the fire water like it was solid ground. Chapter 117, Politics. He left his newly formed mindscape in a daze and needed a few moments to sort of reboot mentally, ironic, and check the time. 10 minutes till 6, which meant that it was time to head over to the Great Hall for dinner. It should be noted that ever since the dinner where Dumbledore had announced the escape of Grindelwald, the man in question had simply not shown up at all anywhere for some reason. It made the entire wizarding world nervous, as they all assumed that he had some horrible plan in mind and was waiting for the perfect moment to spring it. Nick had a different theory, however, that the old Dark Lord was focusing on restoring his previous power after having been stagnant for the last 50 years. This was what Nick would do in that same position, as it would be rather foolish to make a spectacle when weak. This actually reminded Nick of a rather large headache he had been putting off since his bloodline was revealed. He had gotten no less than 20 marriage proposals from various pure-blood families that he had been ignoring. He barely understood the politics behind the things and as a result hadn't sent any replies at all. The most awkward one, however, belonged to none other than House Greengrass, and basically all but offered him the world in exchange for marrying into that family. Daphne insisted that it wasn't her idea, and he believed her due to how horrified she looked when he showed her. Marriage between friends wasn't uncommon, but the fact was that neither of them was actually interested in the other party in that regard. Though that may be more to do with them being 11 than anything else. Nonetheless, it made things rather tense between Daphne and her family, as they hadn't withdrawn the proposal even after she confronted them. Ron's family, however, had instead sent him congratulations and even a thank you note for being friends with Ron. Nick couldn't help but be a little jealous of his red-headed friend, as it was clear that his family truly cared even if they couldn't show it in any monetary way. Speaking of money, Gringotts had started to send Nick letters with information on all the properties and debts that the Ravenclaw family was owed, as well as the vault balance. Surprisingly, there was a few properties that belonged to the Ravenclaw family still standing or being occupied by others due to the lack of known owners till now. Exactly 4, to be precise: 2 castles, 1 forest, and an entire island that had been unaccounted for till now. Despite the family having been basically long considered dead, the businesses who owed the Ravenclaw household money had paid up until they went out of business for whatever reason, so there was a crazy amount of money sitting in the vault. Like I burn money to stay warm at night sort of money. It was rather overwhelming, really. By far the worst part about the public nature of the reveal, which he got Snape back for thanks to the twins, was that the entire British wizarding community was scrabbling to get his favour. Nick had gotten letters from even the Minister of Magic Cornelius Fudge himself, seeking the massive politic clout that an heir to a Hogwarts founder had, so long as they didn't do something to ruin it. This had actually been the reason the Gaunt family was so destitute before a certain person killed off all the others. The family was notoriously high-handed and well known to delve in the dark arts freely. Basically, they simply had no one willing to associate with them, and as a result of their pure-blood mindset couldn't find enough suitable spouses to continue the bloodline. The Hufflepuff bloodline was still around, though, in the form of the Smith family, who had a lot of descendants. Nick had gotten a few letters from that family on account of the two founders being good friends long ago. Not even political letters either, just casual chatting type things where the head of the house was checking to see if he was healthy or needed anything. Nick actually laughed at this, as it fit with the friendly and caring image of the Hufflepuff house he was familiar with. He could only sigh at all this, however, as he was at the center of this massive political shitstorm. His every move was measured and careful so he didn't accidentally become a social pariah for seemingly no reason. The fame hadn't been all political bad news, however, as he actually had enough sway to blow the direction of the wizarding world ever so slightly. An example of this was how his retaliation against Dumbledore had cost the man one of his titles and a good chunk of political pull along with it, since what he did, while not illegal, was very much frowned upon. Chapter 118, A Dark Lord's Struggle. Voldemort had also not been having a very good time at all recently, as the sudden escape of Grindelwald caused the security around where he was sure the stone was hidden to be tightened harshly. At first he had assumed that he could take his time to dismantle the defenses around the stone, but Quirrell's body was starting to reject his soul and getting damaged. This put him on a deadline that made him quite unhappy, but he happened to know several ways to deal with this problem. For now though he needed to trick that fool Hagrid into telling him the Cerberus's weakness. Voldemort would admit that the reveal of the talented boy Nicholas Iron's heritage caught him off guard, but it also thoroughly started cause him to dislike the boy as well. The Grey Lady's constant presence around the boy made Voldemort nervous that she may tell him about the diadem, which would be rather bad. This proved to be a pointless fear, however, as not only was the diadem undisturbed where he had left it, but the boy had thoroughly separated himself from that old fool in charge of the school. It was amusing to see the reaction the old man had at the vicious retaliation on the boy's part, a marvellous blow in his not-so-humble opinion. Severus had to be commended, however, for the way he handles the situation in having the Weasley boy read out the results. At first glance no one noticed that the Iron Boy was moments away from directly cursing the Dumbledore and had merely been angry at the old man, rightfully so too. Severus had taken a gamble that whatever was written on the papers would protect the boy from any repercussions, and he won too. The title of heir and lord to founding House Ravenclaw was no small shield to be hidden behind in any circle. The boy had taken a bit of revenge for the invasion of his privacy on Severus's part, but he clearly didn't hate his servant over it, so it was fine. Voldemort had decided to leave the boy alone for now, as he would be distracted by the political superstorm he had found himself in for quite a while, rendering him a non-threat for now. Grindelwald's presence was much more of a concern in Voldemort's mind, as having another person on his and Dumbledore's level out and about was not good for his future plans. No, in fact it could honestly be said to be the worst possible thing for his plans, as the previous Dark Lord clearly wouldn't have the moral limitations that Dumbledore did. That had always been the way that Voldemort had managed to clash with the old man in the past, using the lives of others as tools to suppress the old fool. Grindelwald on the other hand would likely just laugh at him if he tried to use that trick on him. I can still take care of the Potter boy as I work to regain my previous glory, the Dark Lord thought while remembering the upcoming Quidditch match involving the Potter scion. Nick meanwhile was debating with himself over the pros and cons of ripping the soul shard in the diadem out once Helena finally told him about it. Clearly she felt that his ability to physically touch spirits would come in very handy in purifying Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem. She wasn't wrong exactly, as he could in theory directly pull the shard off the item without any trouble, but that would in turn expose his own soul to the shard's corruptive influences. Nick wasn't arrogant enough to assume that he was impossible to corrupt with dark magics of this type, which led him to his current mental turmoil. On one hand it would all but remove the need to deal with this very same problem later, but at the same time he was really uncomfortable with the idea of touching such a foul thing with his own spirit. If he knew enough about souls he would simply create a ring that devours the shards on contact, but he was woefully lacking in this regard. The ancient section of the library also wasn't very helpful either, as he had only found a single book on souls in his search, and it was so horribly complex and high level that he couldn't get past the first paragraph. Nick was stuck between a rock, a hard place and a hungry dragon, and he knew it. Do it, don't do it, or put it off, those were his options, and frankly speaking none of them were very attractive. Other than that, however, was the destructive option to use basilisk venom on the Horcrux and totally render the diadem unusable. Chapter 119, Cursed Match. With the fortune currently at his disposal, Nick could totally afford to have some of the venom imported from the few people crazy enough to rear the beast for profit. Whatever, I'll deal with this whole issue later, he thought as he walked towards the Quidditch pitch calmly. It was a brisk and chilly day, but Nick didn't mind the cold as his winter clothes were fairly thick. This game was the first of the season and was played between Gryffindor and Slytherin. As a result, however, Nick, Ron, and Hermione were on an entirely different stand than Tracy and Daphne, who came to cheer for their own team. "Bloody hell, Nick, how are you not freezing?" Ron complained while shivering despite his own set of winter clothes. Nick rolled his eyes and pointed his wand at Ron. "Soleil's Calor," he said, and Ron sighed in relief as the warming charm took effect on him. Hermione meanwhile was holding a closed glass jar with a bright blue flame in it. Blue bell flames, not usable for crafting due to their low temperature but perfect for staying warm. Nick said offhandedly while nodding his head at the girl politely, which she seemed to appreciate. "What about your spell? I didn't find any like it in the library," she asked curiously. Nick grinned. "It's a modification on a little-known warming charm meant to stick to someone rather than simply hit them with some hot air temporarily," he said with a chuckle at her pout. The girl may not being constantly trying to compare herself with him, but it didn't mean she didn't still have a competitive streak that showed whenever she was shown up. Nick's spell was clearly the superior one between the two of them, as it didn't require a jar like hers did. Still, Hermione wasn't stubborn enough to insist on using her own spell when there was a better option. "It's like this." Nick saw her about to ask about the spell, so he shared it with her without any problem, so it came as no surprise that she grasped it immediately. It wasn't an overly complicated or even impressive spell, as there was nearly 100 different warming charms that had been made over the years. This one wasn't anything special, so Nick didn't mind passing it out, which he ended up having to do anyways since the rest of his housemates got jealous. Soon enough though, the match officially began and there was a tense stare down between the Slytherin team and Gryffindor team, while Madam Hooch stood between the two teams and dictated the terms of the match. It was simple stuff, really, like wanting a nice clean game and for the two teams to try and keep the injuries to a minimum. Unlike what one would expect, the balls weren't released at the same time, but rather it was first the blood jars, magical self-propellant cannonballs that served as a deterrent during the game. Next up was the ball that really set the game off, the quaffle. This ball had 3 large dents placed along the sides to allow easy grasping of it and wasn't magical at all, save for the ability to float at a certain height and return to the field after being tossed through the goals. The game started off with a rough bit of scrimmage over the possession of this ball between the chasers. Oliver Wood was the keeper and as a result was already waiting at the Gryffindor set of goals while the Slytherin keeper was at theirs. Harry flew high above the rest of the field, likely to stay safe until he could find the snitch that hadn't been released yet. Lee Jordan was commentating the match with McGonagall keeping him neutral, though he was clearly biased towards his own house of Gryffindor. The first goal of the game went to Gryffindor, giving them a nice head start in points before the quaffle was taken by Slytherin and the snitch was finally released. Nick's eyes had caught the little golden ball with wings the moment it had shot out of a small hole under the stands. He didn't say anything about it, however, as that would be tantamount to saying he was a better seeker than Harry, and he didn't want to risk the old man putting him on the team as well to try and earn some favor from Nick. The man had already proven to have a problem with trying to earn favor and merely making a mess instead, though his original objective had been accomplished to a degree. Nick certainly wasn't afraid of him anymore and now was only trying to stay away from the problematic old goat. Chapter 120, Plot and Shields. Nick watched as the snitch flitted past Adrian Pusey, causing the boy to lose the quaffle from the surprise, and both Harry and the Slytherin seeker hurtled towards the flying golden golf ball from their respective positions in the sky. Harry was a bit faster, however, and got a firm lead on chasing the snitch when Marcus Flint slammed into him to cut him off, earning a foul on Slytherin and giving Gryffindor a free shot. Once the game restarted, Nick narrowed his eyes at Quirrell as he saw Harry's broom start to act up. Hagrid, who had joined them in the stands by this point, also noticed this and mentioned how something was wrong. Hermione, being the ever-reliable person she was, pointed out how Snape was staring at Harry from the adult stands and muttering something before wanting to rush off to do something, only to be stopped by Nick. He raised his wand and pointed across the pitch at Quirrell before an invisible pulse flew from it straight at the possessed man. Immediately Quirrell recoiled as an invisible legilimency attack struck him, breaking both his concentration and spell, freeing Harry's broom. Nick quickly hid his wand before anyone noticed what happened and earned weird looks from both Ron and Hermione, but he simply shook his head and focused back on the game. Quirrell looked positively livid at the moment, as his face had turned red and veins had popped out on his neck while he ground his teeth. He scanned the crowds to try and find whoever dares to attack his mind, but all he saw was people focusing on the game, leaving him frustrated and without a place to vent his anger. The man stormed off from the stands angrily, but everyone was too busy watching the match to care. Harry meanwhile looked like he was about to throw up, but instead spat out the snitch that he had somehow caught in his mouth. "I've got the snitch!" he exclaimed while holding it high, and the crowds went wild as the game was over. All in all, it was a pretty fast match, barely taking 30 minutes to finish when it could have taken much longer. There was actually a world record of a game taking 8 whole days to finish, since the Seekers kept getting stopped and nobody was scoring. Hagrid was making tea for the group of friends after the whole match was over, and Hermione and Ron started to argue about Snape's involvement in the attempt on Harry's life earlier with Hagrid. Nick wisely kept himself out of it, even when Hagrid accidentally spoke of the Cerberus in the castle that Harry had apparently overheard Snape talking to himself about earlier in the week after getting bit. So the idea came into existence amongst the Golden Trio that Snape was trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone and they needed to do something about it, despite being a bunch of first years. Nick chose not to interfere, as even in the books nothing of note happened for a month and a half after this match. Instead he simply went back to his preparations in the workshop, and today's work was especially important. Nick sat against the wall of the workshop with his eyes closed as he entered his mindscape once again. "I'll first get a center point set up to serve as the hub for my mind," he thought before starting to move the floating stones around towards each other and having massive vines form between them to sort of anchor them together. This created the scenic look of a floating mountain range, and with the lighting and fire water going through and under the range was quite beautiful. Next he levitated into the air by his will alongside the item facets and landed on the largest floating rock that was in the center of the mountain range. But though its top was flattened and smoothed out, and Nick started the real work by forcefully moving the center of his mindscape to this exact point. The whole mindscape shuddered as the change took hold but remained stable and strong in the end. Now for my defenses. Nick thought seriously before a dense fog began to billow out from his mental self and reach the very edges of his mindscape before taking the form of many hexagonal lattices interwoven like a net around the whole thing. The trick to occlumency shields was that they were very much dependent on the owner's perception of them. In this case Nick chose what he remembered as the strongest natural shape as the outside layer of his shields. Occlumency shields didn't need to be only single layer but rather could be as complicated or simple as the user liked. Chapter 121, Refurbishing Sanner. Nick personally had a four-fold protective system in mind as his set of shields. The airtight hexagonal lattice net for initial detection followed by an endless swarm of birds as both an attack and distraction. After that there would be a massive fortress around the center of his mindscape and inside that would reside an immortal army of ring wraith clones heavily armed with magic and weaponry. Thanks to the way occlumency worked, however, Nick had to wait for his first layer of defense to solidify into place before he could work on the second. He opened his eyes and breathed out in relief at having at least something set up to keep others from messing with his mind. I take it you are done with whatever it was that you have been doing there? Helena asked and Nick nodded. Yet I was setting up my occlumency shield for later and now I can finally reforge this thing. He said, raising his right hand and showing off Sanner. It's hard to understand why you don't need runes to enchant stuff, but I assume it's a unique trait of this method. She said while rather unwillingly putting the hammer down. Nick stood up and stretched before going and moving her art supplies to the other side of the room for their own good and detaching the brush on the end of the hammer and lighting the furnace. He then locked the door before slipping Sanner off his finger and placing it on the anvil nearby as the furnace warmed up. It didn't take long and Nick switched the flames to dragon fire before using a pair of tongs to move Sanner into the flames. Normally Nick would heat the metal till workable before enchanting, but in this case he was heating it to remove the previous enchantment. Once the previous enchantment was gone he wasted no time to remove the ring and place it on the anvil before turning the furnace off. Grabbing the hammer, Nick began to channel his spirit while making sure it was entirely concentrated into his hand and the hammer held within it. With his new knowledge of the mind arts as the base, Nick swings his hammer and speaks comma. And on impact a small word written in elvish areas in the air next to the ring for but a moment. Nick strikes once again Sanner. And that original word appears, though this time followed by another. By this point Helena has noticed that this process is different than the usual one Nick used and watches curiously. Another hammer strike ista. And a third word appears for a total of 3 words, and Nick repeats the order of the words spoken as he strikes the ring over and over again. A loud hum and bright glow fill the room with every hit and Helena could only gaze on in wonder at the impressive sight before her. Finally the hum reaches a fever pitch and the glow can grow no stronger. Nick finally brings the hammer down one last time. Sanner Atta, he says, and the 3 words flash bright and clearly before sinking into the engraved versions of themselves now found on the side of the simple band. Nick grew much weaker the instant the forging was done, but unlike the last time he attempted word infusion he wasn't struck with backlash this time, though he could feel that it was a very close thing. He ravenously devoured an entire loaf of lembas bread as his body was on the verge of eating itself. Ring name, Sanner Atta. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Mental Shielding, Auto-Sizing, Defensive Counterattack, Growth, Mind Art Affinity. Description: a simple band ring forged in the Celebrumber style by Nicholas Iron with the will to protect his mind from all outside attacks and the knowledge on how to do it. This piece's power will grow the more its wearer does. System Appraisal: a powerful ring that is the bane of all legilimens made by an up-and-coming ringsmith. After resting a few moments to alleviate some of the soreness all over his body, Nick checked the appraisal of the ring from the system and smiled as he put the ring back on his pointer finger. Immediately he could feel the ring's magic connect to his own as well as to his occlumency shield, with it them growing to match that level immediately. For all intents and purposes Nick now had 2 shields over his mind, with one of them being much stronger than the other. He still wasn't immune to mind attacks, but at least now he may be able to react to any and defend himself. What was that? Some new breakthrough in your enchanting technique? Helena asked eagerly. Nick chuckled and shook his head. Nah, I've had it for a while now but couldn't use it without overdrafting my spirit energy, until now that is. He said honestly. He had no reason to hide the information from her as she had sworn an unbreakable oath and couldn't share the information without getting banished from the earth for it. Nick very much doubted that betraying him and getting booted off the world to the afterlife forcefully was worth whatever someone may offer her. Chapter 122, Background Information. Helena was surprised to hear this, and it showed by her expression. Oh, Mother would have simply loved you. Just how far do you have this enchantment method completed in that head of yours? She wondered out loud, not expecting that he would actually answer. Nick of course decided that it would be best if he kept that there was another 2 levels beyond this one to the crafting style a secret for now. She may not be able to spill the beans to anyone else, but that didn't mean she couldn't pout for a long time. Nick might be able to resist a sad look for a while, but eventually he would give in as he wasn't heartless. On an entirely unrelated note, Professor Flitwick had finally managed to get the contract drawn up to watch Nick enchant things. It was a simply magically binding contract that pretty much just said that anything he learned or saw in Nick's workshop couldn't be used or shared outside of it. The punishment for breaking the contract was of course immediate and violent loss of life. Goblins did not play around about the contracts involving craftsmen or their secrets. The small professor had very little free time, however, so Nick had agreed to allow him to watch during the Christmas break when he was mostly caught up on work already. Flitwick wasn't really all that surprised to find out that Helena had been pretty much haunting Nick since his heritage was revealed, given who she was. The small man did express remorse for that whole situation and apologized to Nick for Dumbledore's actions. Nick made it clear, however, that he didn't blame any of the other professors for the man's actions, as they were clearly unaware of them, and that only the old goat himself owed an apology. That's right, Dumbledore still hadn't personally apologized for his actions despite having been given ample opportunity to do so. If Nick didn't know better, he'd assume that the man was avoiding the whole conversation that will inevitably happen. The fact was, however, that Dumbledore simply lacked the time necessary to hold that conversation, what with all the effort he needed to track down Grindelwald. Nick understood this, which is the only reason he hadn't gotten even more upset at the old man yet, but eventually the two of them will need to truly speak of the situation before it starts to fester. Nick snapped out of his thoughts, however, and shakily stood up as his body groaned in protest at the movement. "I think I'll spend a couple hours in the library. Keep an eye on the workshop, will you?" he said as he walked out of the room tiredly. Taking a vial out from greed, Nick downed the awful-tasting contents and sighed in relief as the soreness in his muscles slowly started to fade away. This was a potion recipe he had found in the ancient section that basically accelerated the growth and healing process of muscles after they've been worked. It was made under the commission of some Muggle lord in order to vastly accelerate the fitness training that soldiers and knights had to undergo for their armors and weapons. The potion never really saw much use, however, as the cost to brew a batch of the potion was rather expensive and each batch merely contained 15 portions. This meant either 15 workouts or a single workout for 15 people. Nick was even kind enough to donate the recipe to Madame Pomfrey alongside a translated copy of Slytherin's book on healing mind injuries, all anonymously of course. Nick himself had simply commissioned the twins to brew some of the potion for him for a small amount of coin and the potion recipe to be used however they wished. Nick totally didn't notice that they now seemed to have a habit of flexing at random moments with stupid grins on their faces. Nope, not at all. Narcissism aside, the potion did vastly accelerate the amount of muscle Nick packed under his robes from his work. He wasn't like stupid muscular or anything, but his body did have clear definition. The library was fairly empty today, what with it being a Saturday and everyone having friends to hang out with or villages to visit. Madame Pants of course made sure to glare hatefully at Nick when he entered the library, but he just ignored the woman. Looking over the shelves, Nick didn't really have a topic in mind for this particular dive into the vast amount of knowledge, but a faded red leather-bound book caught his attention. Picking it up, he read the title on the cover, A Compendium of Alchemical Substances PT1. He smiled at this and found himself a nearby chair to enjoy his new find. Chapter 123, Dark Undercurrents. The book made it clear right at the start that this was not a guide to alchemy, which made Nick chuckle. The book's contents weren't about the art of alchemy either, but rather a list of the best-known alchemical items and what they did. It was an interesting and light topic to read, as it wasn't teaching anything but rather was just a picture of the item and a description of it. Not all the entries had a picture to go along with them for obvious reasons like the Philosopher's Stone, but the descriptions were very informative. Nick took his sweet time reading the book until lunchtime and headed to the Great Hall to fuel up and maybe hang out with his friends a bit. Things were going fairly normally for the meal before a glowing leopard entered the Great Hall and bounded up to Dumbledore before dissipating and leaving the man with a concerned expression. Nick recognized the leopard as a patroness and could guess that its owner had used it to deliver an urgent message to the headmaster. Whatever the message was seemed to have the man very concerned as he left the Great Hall in a hurry. Flashback to earlier today in a small town on the outskirts of France that was enjoying a normal winter's day when a tall man with a thin build, neatly combed white hair and clean-shaven face walked into the town in a dark green suit. The man had eyes with two different colors and a peaceful smile on his face. This was Grindelwald, but unlike the aged and feeble appearance he once had, he now appeared youthful and full of strength. Pop! 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 3 loud popping sounds appeared near Grindelwald, and in the now occupied space around the Dark Lord 3 people with eager expressions appeared out of thin air. "Sir!" the 3 wizards said and saluted Grindelwald respectfully. Today we take the first step on righting the wrong that has been done to wizard kind. Prepare the barrier. The Dark Lord said, and the three wizards eagerly ran in separate directions to surround the town from different locations. Some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good, and I thank you for your contribution to the cause. Grindelwald said sincerely and bowed to the town before pulling out a wand from the right side of his suit and erecting his side of the barrier. Back to the present, Dumbledore could only feel horror at the information that his confidant in the Ministry, Kingsley Shacklebolt, had told him. An entire town in France had been sacrificed in a massive ritual whose purpose was entirely unknown, and it bore Gellert's magical signature. Unfortunately, the ritual circle had long been destroyed when the Aurors had arrived on the scene, and the residual magic was scattered and distorted, making it impossible to find out what the ritual was meant to accomplish. Dumbledore had hoped in his heart that his old friend had mellowed out after 50 years of imprisonment, but it would seem Gellert was the same as before, if not worse. Dumbledore didn't know what it was that his old friend had planned, but what he did know was that it meant nothing good for the world. "Fawkes, I need you to take me to the French Ministry of Magic, it's Gellert," Dumbledore said seriously when he entered his office, and the bird didn't hesitate to land on his shoulders, and they both burst into gold and red flames and vanished from the office instantly. No one in the school knew what had happened until the next day at breakfast, when the Daily Prophet had the incident on the headlines. While everyone could tell that this was a horrible event, only the professors and Nick seemed to really understand the significance of sacrificing an entire town for a ritual. Rituals very much were like alchemy in that the biggest rule of all of them was equivalent exchange, so the question needed to be asked, what was worth an entire town? Nick didn't know, but he was sure that it probably wasn't anything good considering the information on Grindelwald he knew or was able to dig up. "I need to improve my power as fast as possible," Nick thought seriously as he left the Great Hall and turned many shortcuts straight to the 7th floor. Walking to the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy, he paced back and forth in front of a blank wall, all while thinking, "I need a place to safely create poison smoke," over and over. Soon a wooden door appeared on the previously empty wall, and Nick wasted no time at all, entering the room with a serious expression. Chapter 124, Training. The room was pretty much empty save for the single cage in the center of the room that held a very confused but normal rat. Nick made sure that he hadn't accidentally gotten Peter Pettigrew, as that would be quite awkward. The plans he had to free Sirius early were very dependent on that particular rat not being any the wiser until it was far too late to react. Technically all Sirius was in Azkaban for was blowing up a street and killing Peter along with a few muggles, so with the rat being proven to still be alive, he will have served the sentence and then a lot more for the crime. Once that rat in the room was proven to not be Peter, Nick transfigured his robes into a hazmat suit with an air filter and face shield. "Fumos toxicus," he said, but stopped himself when he noticed the spell about to backfire thanks to his magical senses. Either the wand movement or the word choice were off, he deduced seriously before trying a different set wand movements with the same word choice, but the result was the same. So it's the word choice. Perhaps toxic smoke is a bit too on the nose, he pondered with a frown. "Hydri Fumi can't," he said, and this time the spell activated but was clearly struggling to be produced, so he cancelled it and tried other wand movements until he got the one that worked. Pointing the wand at the cage in the center of the room, he cast the spell, and dark purple smoke with green streaks in it began to come out of the end of his wand before creeping across the room towards the cage. The rat looked cautious of the smoke rolling towards it, but that changed when the smoke actually reached it. "Eeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeee in mere moment only silence and bones lay in the cage as Nick cut the spell with a back full of sweat. The spell exceeded his expectations, was a wide margin, and would without a doubt be considered as dark magic for the inhumane way it killed those it touched. This is definitely going on the breakout only in emergencies list of spells. Dear God, that poor rat. Nick thought, disgusted by his creation. He didn't like anything that caused unnecessary suffering, and this spell clearly counted if the agony of the rat was anything to go by. Still, he needed to be able to protect himself and kept the spell despite his distaste of it. Moving on from modifying the Fumos charm for combat, the room visibly shifted and changed into an empty one save for the bookshelf in the center that Nick approached while dispelling the transfiguration on his robes. These books were on shield spells, and he wanted to use the room to learn of them, since searching the library when this room could grab the non-enchanted books was pointless. That was actually the reason Nick had simply stolen a few books rather than copy them instead: enchantments. Most of the books in the library were enchanted to be uncopyable via magic, and as you might expect, writing them out by hand was far too time-consuming to be worth it. There were a few books, however, that the enchantment had been removed from, or the enchantment had lost power, leaving them copyable. The room took advantage of this to create copies of them for its own use. The bookshelf only had 5 books on it, which was not all that surprising considering how well the books in the library were usually treated. The librarian regularly recast the self-cleaning and damage resistance enchantments on the library after all, once a year in fact. This meant that you really had to try in order to destroy a book and couldn't do so on accident, usually anyways. These 5 books covered self-defense charms such as Protego and even the highly advanced NOHAREM spell that summoned a multi-layered dome of barriers around the caster. Nick of course read each of the books entirely before deciding on any spells to practice. From this he learned that most shield spells were created exclusively to protect oneself by cowards mostly. People afraid of harm but unwilling to learn how to properly protect themselves channeled their energy instead into shield spells to repel outside attacks. Nick found it funny how it was cowards who created the very spells that brave men used to battle without worry. He couldn't really cast judgment on these people however, as everyone has something that they fear and the fact they did something to confront their fears was impressive enough in his opinion. Chapter 125, Shield Spells. The easiest shield spell according to these books was the Protego spell that was taught in the 4th year of Hogwarts normally. Despite being taught the spell at that time, very few students could actually perform it, as one of its requirements was the genuine fear of harm. Once the spell was successfully cast with this emotion however, any cast after that no longer require it. It was an unusual requirement but also a hard one to fulfill in the confines of the school. Most people who successfully learn it have magical spars with others to simulate actual combat and thus a fear of harm. Nick on the other hand was going to be much crueler to himself and have the room create enchanted spell casters that will hit him with legitimately harmful spells like the Severing Charm Diffindo. Soon the room shifted into a sort of octagon with these enchanted spell casters placed randomly around the room's walls. Nick stood in the center of the room and transfigured his clothes into only a single pair of thick shorts that were metal on the groin to protect that particular area from any spells that may target it. "Begin," he said calmly, and immediately a small red spell shot at him from the left Protego. He said quickly, but all he got was a blue spark out of his wand and his eyes narrowed before the spell struck his left arm and opened a nasty-looking gash. Gritting his teeth, Nick ignored the pain and focused his attention around him for the next spell. This time it came from the back and he quickly turned around and pointed his wand at the this time purple light Protego. He said, and once again he merely got a spark and a bruise for his effort. Nick quickly lost count the amount of times he was struck with painful spells, but once the room told him of the approaching dinner time he stopped the training in a horrible state. Pulling a Wiggenweld potion out of greed, he popped the glass top off and downed the bitter potion. Dozens of cuts, bruises and burns all over his body closed up or scabbed over as the potion worked its magic, much to his relief. "Nen," he said, and water came out of his wand and began to cleanse the dried or fresh blood, sweat and tears all over his body. The last few hours were little more than pure suffering on his part, as he barely made any progress on the spell as he got a flickering blue light at the end of his wand, but that was it. In exchange for this progress he was cut, impacted and burned on multiple places on his body. Nick knew that the reason for his failure at casting the spell came from both its level being past his current spell casting level by a wide margin as well as his natural disregard for his safety. He didn't enjoy getting hurt, but he certainly didn't fear the idea of it, and it was this very character trait that was considered admirable normally that was stopping him from making any decent progress. Removing the transfiguration on his robes, the many new and healing injuries on his body were covered beneath them. Steeling his face, he left the room and headed towards the Great Hall while keeping the pain of movement from showing on his face. The terror of the news that showed up at breakfast still hadn't died down yet, and Nick honestly didn't think it ever would so long as Grindelwald was out and about. Nick sat next to Harry and opposite Ron at the Gryffindor table while waiting for the food to arrive. They gasped when he rolled up his robe sleeves a bit so that they don't get into the food as he ate. "Bloody hell! What happened to your arms?" Ron exclaimed in shock at the many scabs and discolored patches of skin that adorned Nick's arms. "Not to worry, I'm fine. I did it to myself, to be honest. I overestimated myself a bit and this was the result is all," Nick said reassuringly. "What were you trying to do that could cause that?" Hermione asked from the opposite side of Harry with a concerned expression. "Just trying to learn the shield charm is all. As it turns out, not being afraid of injury can in fact prove to be detrimental to spell casting," Nick said with a shrug. "Isn't that a 4th-year spell?" Hermione asked in surprise. Nick nodded yes. "Well, with a madman willing to sacrifice a whole town is running around, I figure this." He pointed at his injuries would be a small price to pay for a little safety. He said seriously, and they went quiet as he wasn't wrong. Chapter 126, Argument. "There has to be a better way to do this, Nick," Harry said seriously, but Nick shook his head. "Honestly speaking, if it were anyone else that may in fact be true, but I told you that I simply don't fear injury, so I keep failing, and until I overcome this hurdle it will stay this way," he said with a sigh. He tapped his head. "It a problem with this really, so there is no other option unless you know someone willing to use an unforgivable without meaning to really hurt me," Nick said with a firm and resigned expression. Ron gasped in horror when Nick mentioned having the unforgivable used on him, as that was beyond cruel. He couldn't be blamed either, as the effects that the Cruciatus curse had on someone was well known by the entire wizarding world. A single exposure to the spell was known to drive people to insanity from the pain it brought. Neville's parents were rather well-known examples of this, as even now the two of them sat in St. Mungo's mental ward practically catatonic. They had recently been having a specific set of healing exercises used on them in hopes of recovery, but it was too soon to tell. So for Ron, hearing that the only other option available to Nick was having such an awful thing used on him, he understood just how hard Nick had it learning the Protego spell. Nick's entire plan for this rather extreme training was similar to the work of Pavlov, except he isn't trying to train himself to salivate to a bell, but rather to instinctively fear injury when a spell was cast at him. It was cruel and inhumane, but it was the only option available to him at the moment. After dinner, Nick drank another Wiggenweld potion before going to bed, fully prepared to get cursed at in his dreams. As a result, he wasn't surprised to find himself face to face with a certain elf once he drifted off. The elf didn't say anything, but he didn't need to either, as the look of disappointment on his face spoke volumes to Nick. "It's the only way," Nick said defensively, as he was bothered considerably by the look he was getting. The elf sighed. "I am not disappointed in your willingness to do what you believe is necessary to protect yourself, but how you are choosing to go about it. You are only thinking of spells to solve the problem, but you are a craftsman, so start acting like." The elf yelled angrily, as he simply couldn't hold his temper anymore. Nick flinched at the loud and angry voice, as he simply wasn't used to it. The elf had always been calm and somewhat quiet when he spoke, so him yelling was frightening. "You keep putting your craftsmanship second to focus on your magic instead of using it for everything, and I refuse to hold my tongue any longer." The elf spoke sternly. "You know how this works. I can't just make a ring to protect myself as well as a shield spell without actually understanding the thing," Nick yelled back, as he refused to get lectured by the elf. "Then make something else. Bombs, invisibility, anything else, but stop acting like only this one thing can help you," the elf roared before booting Nick out of the dream. For the first time since he got the system, Nick woke up in the middle of the night. Frustrated, he could only try to go back to sleep, but alas, the elf's words rang true and robbed him of the luxury of sleep. At dawn, Nick officially gave up on the futile attempt to go back to sleep and in a grumpy mood made his way to the workshop. Helena noted his haggard appearance but didn't say anything about it, since it would be rude. "Peeves tried to cause trouble earlier, but I chased him off, and other than that there hasn't been any change in the workshop," she said, and Nick nodded before sitting against the wall and closing his eyes to delve into his mindscape. Unlike what he expected, however, he was immediately greeted by a gauntlet fist to the face as soon as he opened his eyes within the mindscape. "Fuck." He cursed loudly from the sudden pain before the injury seemed to magically fade away and he could open his eyes again to see what hit him. "You need the fear of pain to cast that spell of yours? Fine, I'll make you fear pain then," an angry but very familiar voice said from where he had just been struck. "You!" Nick hissed angrily as he glared at a certain elf that stood within his mindscape in full silver and golden armor. Chapter 127, Beatdown. "Until now I was only capable of appearing in the astral realm, but now that you have this realm I can appear here as well. Now you face Celebrimbor, Lord of Eregion and son of Fëanor," the elf said aggressively before charging Nick. Focusing his thoughts, Nick tried to shift the mindscape, but he found it resisting him, which caused his eyes to go wide before Celebrimbor punched him in the face again, hard. What came after this was a one-sided beatdown where Nick tried to resist but was totally overwhelmed by his stronger, faster and more experienced opponent. The pain of each and every hit felt as if he truly was getting struck, but faded away moments later only to be instantly replaced with more pain. Celebrimbor had long calmed down but still refused to stop beating the shit out of Nick because he had a goal in mind and it hadn't been achieved yet. This had turned to beating even more brutal as the elf sought to inflict as much pain as possible in as short a window as possible. Broken limbs, ruptured organs, torn out eyes, any physical injury you could think of by a person had been committed onto Nick. After 3 hours of this torment, Nick finally started to turn desperate to retaliate in some way, any way to make the pain stop. Celebrimbor seemed to notice this and with a content smile finally backed off. The next attack that Nick expected simply didn't come, and instead he heard, "Now that you know the fear of injury, go do something about it while I explore this fascinating realm." Followed by footsteps leaving. Nick was left sprawled out on the ground, not injured but certainly exhausted from the beatdown he had just received. So that just happened, he thought unusually calmly for someone who had just received the beating of a lifetime without being able to retaliate at all. "Fine then, I'll put this fear of yours to use, but don't expect this to be the end of this matter," he said, but if Celebrimbor heard him, the elf didn't show any reaction as he walked into the distance. Nick left his mindscape with the mother of all headaches waiting for him and a gushing nosebleed. "Are you okay?" Helena asked, concerned as such a thing tended to bode ill. "Yeah, I'll be fine in a bit," Nick said as he took a bottle of Wiggenweld out of greed and downed it to stop the bleeding. He then transfigured the blood out of his robes before standing up and pointing his wand in front of him. "Protego." He spoke while remembering the desperate feeling of wanting the pain to end. At the end of his wand a small and flickering light blue barrier appeared. Nick smiled at this as he finally didn't need to worry so much about the spell, as all subsequent cast would be much easier and stronger. Helena was surprised to see him cast the spell at all, even if it wasn't a very impressive example of it. "Well done," she praised honestly, and Nick shook his head with a bitter expression. "I wouldn't have been able to do it without someone else's help, so it seems I owe them a favor. What a pain," Nick said honestly. He wasn't so ungrateful or stupid enough to not figure out that Celebrimbor had basically antagonized and beaten his mental self in order to provide guidance. Truthfully speaking, he hadn't actually done anything of worth to Nick, as in his own mind Nick was immortal and healed nearly instantly from any damage, so besides being temporarily unpleasant, this whole experience was totally harmless. The old elf was probably being honest when he said that Nick was neglecting his craftsmanship in favor of magic, but Nick couldn't really be blamed as magic was so useful for literally everything. It was also in most cases way easier as it didn't require copious amounts of personal knowledge to work. Still, the fact remained that unlike Dumbledore, the old elf hadn't violated his privacy or safety with his actions. Nick spent the rest of the day after that familiarizing himself with the Protego spell so that it wasn't basically magical tissue paper. It was slow going due to how magically intensive the spell was, as he ran out of magical energy pretty fast casting the spell. So the reason they only teach it in the 4th year is because any sooner and you probably won't have enough energy to use it, Nick noted seriously. This at the very least told him that his current limit for spells he could learn was within that range and let him save time experimenting to find it out. Chapter 128, Thieving Steve. His friends were much more relaxed at dinner this time, as he didn't have awful wounds all over his arms. "Did you already figure out how to use the shield charm, Nick?" Ron asked in surprise. Nick nodded, but a slight twitch of his eyebrow told Harry and Hermione not to ask how. Ron did not get that message though. "That's incredible. How'd you manage it without getting gnarled up like before?" he asked, and Nick took a deep breath and repressed the urge to curse at the dense boy angrily and calmly said he'd rather not talk about it. Ron looked dissatisfied with this answer, but before he could dig a deep hole to be buried in, Harry changed the topic to the Quidditch tactic Nick had suggested before. Apparently it had taken a bit, but Harry had gotten the hang of performing the maneuver while at a full stop, which represented initial mastery of it. Ron was full of praise for this, as it was a very impressive thing for a non-professional player to do, so maybe the scouters will start sending offers once they see it for themselves. Things moved on fairly normally after that, with nothing of note until a week from then, when Nick finally gained enough proficiency with the shield charm to shift the trajectory of spells so long as they weren't too powerful. With this level of knowledge, he wanted to try and make backup disposable rings that held a single powerful shield that automatically protected its wielder before breaking. These would be his bread and butter for the next step of his plan to popularize his name as a craftsman. With all the panic going around because of Grindelwald, people would jump at the protective items since he planned to sell them at the cheap price of 10 sickles. To put that into perspective, this was about the price of a first year's school books, and with a minimum of 5 galleons a month for literally any wizarding job, it was quite affordable in most cases. The only real problem came in the form of permission by the staff of Hogwarts and Ministry of Magic. The ministry was a piece of cake, as Minister Fudge had been trying to curry favor with him for a while now, so a casual mention of it would get it approved in a hurry by the man. The real problem is the Hogwarts staff. Dumbledore may agree, as it is a good way to make people feel secure in their safety, even if only a little. But the rest may take issue with me using the fear of others to make a profit, McGonagall especially. Nick thought seriously as he played with the niffler that had somehow made its way into his workshop. Nifflers were small creatures that had bodies similar to that of a hedgehog but bigger at the size of a cat. They had buck-billed mouths and large dark eyes, as well as a pouch on their bellies that had an expanded space in it. The most well-known thing about them, however, was how they were notoriously greedy, to the point of there being actual cases of them stealing from dragons. They were unrepentant thieves and extremely good at sniffing out and filching any treasure nearby, regardless of whether it was a good idea or not. This particular niffler had been trapped in the workshop by Helena after trying to steal one of the gold ingots Nick had stacked up against the wall. It had a black fur color and light brown eyes and tried to act pathetic when Nick finally walked into the room. Nick took a liking to the little thief and offered Lemba's bread in exchange for not having his stuff stolen, an agreement the Niffler accepted after trying some of the bread. Nick had brought the creature to Hagrid the first chance he got, but the half-giant wasn't familiar with this particular Niffler, as the one he took care of had brown fur and black eyes. After that, the Niffler who Nick named Thieving Steve had pretty much followed Nick everywhere. Strangely enough, McGonagall was quite taken with the greedy thing and spoiled it rotten with cookies whenever Nick had class. Then again, it's not just her either, literally almost all the girls who see the bastard fawn all over it. I admit he's kinda cute, but this is nuts. Nick thought, looking at the pile of sweets stacked up neatly in Steve's personal corner of the workshop. That corner had a magical bird bath, dog bed, and blankets alongside his hoard of ill-gotten loot. Most of it was comprised of coins, but there was hairpins, brooches, and even a silver spoon for some reason. Chapter 129, Talking to McGonagall. Nick was currently playing fetch with Steve using a joke toy the twins made that was a ball that moves away from you every time you try to pick it up. It was amusing to watch as the surprisingly fast creature dashed all over the room after the ball that was always one step ahead of him. Steve was clever, however, and eventually managed to pin the ball in a corner, after which he held it up above his head triumphantly. Looks like something I'll need to give those two a heads up about, Nick said with a smile that Helena shared. Yes, an uncatchable ball that can be caught using a corner is quite flawed, she said seriously, and Steve looked horrified at the conversation. Nick laughed at the creature's expression. I promise you can keep the ball, Steve, relax, he said before standing up and patting the dust off the backside of his robes. Come along, Steve, I've got to go talk to McGonagall about something and maybe you can sweet talk her into agreeing, he said before walking to the door of the workshop and opening it. Steve quickly dashed across the room and up onto Nick's shoulder before he could shut the door again. Nick merely smirked at the creature's antics before making his way to his head of house's office. It was a short trip since his workshop was on the same floor as her office and merely a few doors down, in fact. Knocking on the door, Nick waited for a moment and a voice came from the other side. You may enter, Professor McGonagall said calmly, and he opened the door. The elderly witch smiled warmly seeing who had entered her office. Mr. Iron. She paused for a moment. Apologies, Ravenclaw. It is still difficult to keep track, I'm afraid, she said apologetically. Nick chuckled. Believe me, I am aware, and it's my own name, he joked, and she smiled a little wider. Indeed, but I imagine that this is not the reason you are here, she said with an implied question. No, it is not. You are aware of my newest spell from the rumors, correct? He asked calmly. I am not one for gossip, but yes, I am aware of the rumors saying you have learned the shield charm. I take it they are true then. She sought confirmation and Nick waved his wand pro to go. He said, and a thin blue but stable barrier appeared at the tip of his wand. He then cut the flow of magic to the spell and it faded out of existence just as fast as it appeared. Rather weak for a shield charm, but you clearly have the basics down, so well done. 20 points to Gryffindor for your efforts. Nick shook his head. I take it you are familiar with my craftsmanship as well, he asked, entirely not caring about the points he received, a fact McGonagall noted mentally. Indeed, Filius and Rubius speak nothing but praises for the pieces they have seen, and even though he doesn't speak of it, Severus is clearly fond of the ring you crafted for him, she said with a proud smile. Yes, well, I was hoping to get it authorized to sell mass-produced rings with a single-use shield enchantment on them, much stronger than what I can conjure myself, of course, he said, pulling off the band-aid immediately to get the issue out in the open without dancing about it for an hour, as he lacked the patience for such a thing. McGonagall frowned when she heard what Nick said, both for the reason he had speculated she would disapprove of, but also because there was something that didn't add up with what he said. I do not claim to be any professional in enchantment such as Filius, but I am aware that all enchantments require the enchanter to be able to perform the spells for them at the same strength as the enchantment, she said with a stern gaze. Nick merely smiled up her stare. If I enchanted things in the normal fashion, then you would be correct, however I do not, he said with a confident smile. Is that so? How, pray tell, is what you do different? She asked, intrigued, as he definitely seemed to believe what he said. You see, unlike the normal methods of enchanting, my method is only limited by two factors, energy and knowledge. So long as I have ample of both, I can create enchantments far beyond my means to create via the normal method. An example would be this ring here, which I named Greed, that has the properties of a boggart, and yet I am unable to transform freely nor detect the deepest fears of others, he explained, showing off the ring for the umpteenth time. Chapter 130, Talking to McGonagall, 2. I won't go into the details of exactly how I enchant things, as currently the wizarding world doesn't deserve to have that knowledge, but even you must be able to see how advanced this piece is, no, he said, like a tempting devil whispering sin in one's ears. She reluctantly nodded in agreement. It is indeed beyond your current capabilities and is close to being beyond my own as well. Not because of power but complexity, as the ring never ceased its transformations and yet isn't draining magic from you to fuel itself. She said honestly. I know the shield spell and I has enough energy, so making the single-use protective enchantments are simply a matter of time and effort on my end. I'll be honest with you, this isn't about money, as after getting this he showed the Ravenclaw signet ring, I have access to a vast fortune at any given moment. The charge for the rings will not only be entirely reasonable for most to afford but is also a sort of craftsman problem on my end. I simply refuse to give out my work without getting paid for it, as is my right. Nick explained seriously. I admire your honesty, but the fact remains that I have no guarantees that what you are offering is even true. She said with a stern expression, but Nick merely grinned widely, showing off his white teeth. So you would consider it if I could give solid proof of my claims then? He asked, and she froze for a moment before sighing as she realized that she had fallen into a trap and was now looking at a checkmate. Very well, if you can produce solid proof of your claim then I shall send your request to Albus. However, it is out of my hands after that, Mr. Ravenclaw. She said, all business. Nick grinned widely. I don't. That will prove much of a problem, after all the old man owes me dearly. He said before bidding her farewell and leaving her office with a sort of spring in his step. What he didn't know was that McGonagall had always believed him capable of what he said but really didn't like the way he was using fear for his business and had tried to softly reject him. Instead he had played the entire conversation like a game of chess and she lost without even realizing it until it was too late. He is rather adept at misdirection, it seems. She thought with concern over his path. Despite interacting with Nick on a regular basis, she couldn't get a clear read on him, as he was a walking mass of complexes that had no business being found on the same person. He was cold, kind, courageous, paranoid, proud, and humble at the same time, and to top it off he clearly didn't care for tradition or useless prizes. Every professor and a very few students were aware that the house point competition was little more than bragging rights at the end of the day. He has some sort of agenda with this request, but it can't be political. He seems to detest the stuff. Perhaps Albus may be able to shed some light on the matter, she thought before beginning to write up the formal paperwork for Nick's request, as she gave her word and knew he was undoubtedly going to produce the proof she asked for. Still, the sentence Nick left with about Dumbledore worried her greatly, as it showed that he was still holding a grudge for what had happened. Nick meanwhile had already returned to the workshop and after shooing off Steve started up the furnace and switched it over to dragon fire. Metal worked under dragon fire was slightly better at holding enchantments than normal flame-forged metal, so even though Nick was going to use iron for the rings, 'cause it's cheap, he still used the magical flame for it. That reminds that now that I have so much money I need to look into getting more flames. He thought as he tossed a bar of iron into the roaring flames to melt. It didn't take long at all, merely about a minute or so for the metal to liquefy, letting him take it out of the furnace with magic and then dunk the molten metal in a bucket of water he had prepared to rapidly cool it into shape. This time he had specifically turned it into a long rod about half an inch thick and half a foot long. Once cooled and solidified, Nick put the metal back in the furnace, but only until it was hot enough to work, at which point he began segmenting the rod to turn the segments into rings. Chapter 131, Rings of Protection. Nick placed most of the segments to the side to work on later before grabbing one of them and using a steel punch to create a hole in the middle of it. He then began to widen the hole while also making sure to round the edges of the ring, which in the end left him with a plain iron band that was dull grey and unremarkable. Nick repeated this process with all of the rest of the segments, leaving him with 10 plain-looking iron rings. He quickly checked them for any cracks or faults, but after finding none he moved on to the next part of the process. Locking the door to the workshop, he took a deep breath and began to glow the bright white like normal, though this time there was the slightest tinge of gold in the glow, not that anyone realized at that moment. The glow faded somewhat as it became focused entirely on his hand and hammer before he began to strike each of the rings, sending a loud hum through the room. Unlike the twins' rings, these weren't going to be linked together but were rather just being enchanted with the exact same enchantment at the same time. This was obviously extremely energy and time intensive, however it was less than adding multiple powerful effects to a single ring, which was the only reason he attempted it. It took him until around 7 hours to complete the forge, making him miss dinner entirely. It was around 8:45 when he finished, and rather than go to the common room and risk Filch catching him, he simply transfigured the floor into a soft cotton giant pillow and went to sleep on it. Steve wasted no time at all cuddling up next to him as well, and the night passed peacefully. In the morning Nick yawned and stretched as he stood up off the floor that had returned to normal sometime while he was asleep. He wasn't sore from sleeping on the floor thanks to the fact his body was quite sturdy. Still, he made sure to fully work his limbs and back to prevent any hidden cramps from showing up and messing with him. He then grabbed the rings he had simply left on the anvil overnight and checked them with the system. Ring name, Ring of Protection. Grade, Common. Abilities, Auto-sizing, Sacrificial Defense. Description, a plain iron ring created with an inbuilt shield charm that is overpowered in exchange for cost the ring it's on use. System appraisal, a good single-use protective item created by an up-and-coming ringsmith. Each of the rings had an appraisal exactly like this with no differences at all, which proved that Nick had succeeded in creating a mass-produced product. Obviously 10 at a time would prove to be insufficient in the face of the around 100 students in the castle who regularly use or get magic used on them. In fact, Nick will need a stockpile of about double or triple that amount for what he had in mind. Still, there was an upcoming holiday and the free time after classes to make more and more of the rings. If he made 10 more rings every day, then it would take around 20 days for him to stockpile 200 of the things. Obviously not everyone will buy one, but I expect at least 60 or so people to place orders and maybe 20 to order more than one ring at once. At 10 sickles a piece, that's about 36 galleons roughly. Nick thought seriously. He knew that he wasn't doing this for money, but the low amount of profit for his effort stung a bit. It'll pay off in the end, probably, he thought hopefully as he left the workshop with Steve to start his day with breakfast. "Where'd you go yesterday, Nick?" Harry asked curiously when he sat down next to Nick. "Got caught up in a project of mine and lost track of time, slept in the workshop with Steve here," Nick said casually while handing the niffler in question a sausage which it greedily devoured. Contrary to what its cute appearance may lead one to believe, nifflers were omnivores and ate pretty much anything except mint, which they hated for some reason. Hermione looked a bit jealous at the interaction but kept it to herself minus a small pout. Ron joked about how Steve was the perfect pet for Nick as it was just as much of a glutton as he was. Nick laughed at this and merely stated that he was bulking up, but none of them had any idea what he meant, so the joke fell flat. After breakfast it was potions class and Steve needed to make himself scarce during that time, as Snape didn't find it amusing at all when the niffler stole a silver sickle from Malfoy last time and got caught. Nick didn't get detentions but did lose Gryffindor 30 points and had to let Steve spend a day as the Mansquini pig. Steve refused to go anywhere near Snape's class after that. Chapter 132, Holidays. Still, after dealing with his own personal version of hell known as herbology, Nick was finally free to seek out McGonagall with his proof of concept. This meeting went about as accepted as she tested out 2 of the rings personally, and after making sure the rest were the same she took them and went to go see Dumbledore. It came as little surprise to Nick that the old goat agreed to the proposal straight away under the condition that the Ministry of Magic also agreed. Nick merely sent a letter to Fudge talking about the possibility of attending the annual Yule Ball he held, while ever so subtly hinting at wanting his aid for this plan. Despite not technically having permission just yet, Nick already decided to start stockpiling the rings and made 10 more and slept in the workshop again. He worked like this for the next week before the Ministry's acceptance letter arrived alongside a formal invitation to the Yule Ball. "I'm going to need a suit," Nick thought with a sigh. It was going to be his first public appearance at one of these high society events, and that meant that he needed to look his best. The invitation came with a letter explaining how Nick would arrive and depart from the ball, since he would be staying at the school over the holidays as an orphan. The Hogwarts flow connection directly to the Ministry was the path set out for Nick to take. Fudge apparently was going to have someone arrive at Hogwarts and escort Nick to the ball on the 19th of December at 5 o'clock. The party will then last until 8 o'clock, after which Nick will be escorted back to Hogwarts, likely thoroughly mentally exhausted. Nick had to approach McGonagall for a trip to Diagon Alley on the upcoming weekend in order to get his suit made by Madame Malkins. This request was approved and she was sent to chaperone him while he was out of Hogwarts to make sure nothing untoward occurred. Nick was very professional, however, during the trip, and even got an intrigued look from the elderly witch when she heard the specifications on the suit he ordered. It was certainly going to show off his extraordinary appearance in an interesting way. After that, Nick basically just went about his day-to-day business while continuously stocking up on rings of protection. The constant enchanting and forging of rings worked wonders on his points as well as on his efficiency in channeling his spirit. His magic had also grown more potent, but not by an unbelievable degree, since magic was much like a muscle in how it grew. As he regularly worked it out, it also grew more than the most of the other students in the castle. The reason it was most and not all was because Harry's magic was shooting up like a rocket. Nick's theory was that this was because of the power held by the soul shard tricking his magic into thinking his soul was stronger than it was. Nick was happy for Harry rather than jealous of his quick growth, since he had his own benefits. It was a couple of days before the Christmas holidays began and Nick had finally managed to stockpile over 200 rings of protection. With the system giving him 20 points for each, he suddenly found himself sitting pretty at over 4,000 points right now. With the help of the twins and the professors turning a blind eye, Nick advertised his rings of protection school-wide over the next 2 days. He was slightly off on the number of orders he received, as it was 73 people who wanted one and 12 who wanted more than one. In the end he sold 87 total rings, bringing him a profit of 51 galleons and 3 sickles. It was only thanks to the professor's silent endorsement that the sales were such a hit, as many looked to them for verification of the legitimacy of the ring's effect. After getting it, most didn't mind shelling out some of their savings for a ring. The day after the holidays officially began and all the students going home for it were gone, Nick could be found in the workshop looking at himself in a conjured full-length mirror as he adjusted his suit last minute. It was a marvelous piece made of unicorn hair and a chromantula silk in the form of a Muggle-style tuxedo. The coloration, however, was what made it pop, as it was black with a whole lot of small white dots all over it like the starry sky as the suit shimmered slightly in the light. Nick himself had used some easy removed magic hair gel to comb back neatly his usually unruly grey hair. Chapter 133, Overdue Conversation. This combination of many striking features altogether resulted in Nick appearing regal and even slightly imposing despite his young age. "You clean up rather nicely, I would say," Helena complimented his appearance. "Thank you, that is the whole idea for this get-up after all," he said as he dismissed the summoned mirror. "Tempus," he said with a light tap of his wand to check the time. "4:48, I should make my way to the headmaster's office to wait for my escort," he said before leaving the workshop and locking it behind him. The few students still at Hogwarts gasped in awe and pointed as he passed by on his way to Dumbledore's office. McGonagall was waiting outside the large bronze griffin statue that served as the main entryway to the headmaster's area. She smiled appreciatively at him as he approached her. "You clean up well, Mr. Ravenclaw," she praised honestly. "I would certainly hope so with the effort I put into it," he joked with a smirk. "Best be on your way up, as your escort should be arriving any moment," she said before turning to the statue. "Cricket crunchies," she said, and the statue began to move in order to allow passage. Nick merely shook his head at the strange password that Dumbledore had set this time for his office. McGonagall was clearly only here to allow him up, as she left after saying the password with an encouraging pat on the shoulder. Nick steeled his emotions, as for the first time in the entire school year that he was aware of, he will be alone with Dumbledore. His anger had mellowed out over time, but he still very much disliked the man. When he walked into the office, he was rather surprised to find that it was actually very messy. Artifacts, books, scrolls, and unusual things sat in haphazard piles along the side of the office, while a row of paintings adorned the wall, all observing Nick just as he observed them. Once satisfied with his observation, Nick turned to look at the large wooden desk at the far end of the room, or more specifically to the right of it from Nick's perspective. There a large red and golden bird roosted on a metal perch and was looking at Nick with familiar golden-colored eyes warmly. "He has been quite looking forward to this meeting, you know," a calm, wizened voice said lightly. Nick's eyes flitted over to the source of the voice, sitting behind the desk with both hands in plain view, with neither holding a wand. Dumbledore wore his usual grey robes and half-moon spectacles, while a gentle expression sat on his face. "I may have visited sooner had the circumstances been different," Nick said with narrowed eyes and an icy tone. Dumbledore sighed. "I admit I overstepped my bounds earlier this year and apologize for any problems that may have caused you," he said sincerely, and Nick relaxed his hostility. "The resemblance is rather uncanny, you know," Dumbledore said suddenly, looking lost in thought. "In what regards?" Nick asked, not understanding what the old man was referring to. The old man's eyes focused again. "Your eyes. I am one of the few people in the world to have the privilege of meeting both a thunderbird and phoenix before. Besides being birds, did you know that the only trait they visibly share is their eye color?" He answered the question with another. "I was horrified when it chose me, you know. I thought I was completely ruined since the nail that stands out the most," Nick said lightly while looking at the wand in his hand. "Is the first to be struck down, is the rest of that particular phrase, I believe. I cannot claim to not understand your thoughts at the time, an orphan with an extraordinary talent and personality. It does remind me so very much of another pupil of mine who did not turn out how I had hoped. It was my own fear of precisely that drove me to my actions. I sought to provide you a sense of security, of protection. But like so many plans before, I was far too self-absorbed to realize exactly what I had done until it was too late and ruined it instead," Dumbledore said tiredly. "You know, I was so overcome with anger that I came this close to attacking you that day with the most powerful spell I knew at the time. It was only later that I realized that such an action may have placated my wrath at that time, but it would have ruined my future. I don't like you, nor do I think I ever will, but that does not mean a level of cordiality can't exist between us. So unless there is a true need, we stay out of each other's way." "Agreed," Nick said seriously. Silence filled the office for a few moments before Dumbledore slowly nodded and spoke but a single word: agreed. Chapter 134, Yule Ball. The moment the conversation ended, the flames of the nearby Fleur fireplace roared in an emerald color and a man stepped out of the fireplace, not even bothering to remove the soot on his clothes from the Fleur travel. Headmaster, he said respectfully towards Dumbledore, who merely nodded at the man. Alexander, he said, greeting the man. The man had short brown hair and eyes and a large but not fat figure. Alexander looked over at Nick and smiled warmly as he walked over and held out a hand. Alexander Smith of House Hufflepuff and the Auror, in charge of escorting you to and from the minister's ball, he said happily. Nick shook the man's hand firmly. Nicholas Ravenclaw, current regent of House Ravenclaw, and I apologize for the inconvenience, he said with a polite smile. Alexander laughed at this, confusing Nick for a moment before he got an explanation. My Daw's the current lord of House Hufflepuff and told me you'd be a sharp-witted individual, and like usual he wasn't wrong. You've had that name and title for all of about a month, and yet here you are stating it like you've had it your whole life, Alexander said with a chuckle at the look of understanding on Nick's face. I admit that I may have been practicing the introduction a bit recently, Nick said, embarrassed at being figured out so quickly. Trust me, I get it. Even now I get a headache even thinking about all the work set out for me in the future when Maida retires as regent, Alexander said reassuringly. I suppose we ought to make our way over to the ball, don't want to be late after all, Nick said casually, and Alexander nodded in agreement. This was Nick's first experience taking the Fleur, and he had to admit it was fairly interesting in a few ways. The first was of course how it still had a similar feeling to what apparition was said to be like, as it was like being squeezed through a small hole. It wasn't as bad as that though, as it didn't produce any turbulence or nausea. The second was that to his magical senses it was very strange, as for the brief moment that the travel lasted it was like the magic involved cut through itself to work. The reason this was strange was that in the case of spells, when such a thing happened it usually caused a heavy misfire or implosion of whatever spell it was. The fact Fleur travel seemed to require this phenomena left Nick astonished and confused. The final thing was that traveling like this required fire of all things in order to work, and Nick had to admit that he had no clue why, and it intrigued him. When Nick arrived at the Ministry of Magic he quickly dusted off his suit with the magic feather duster next to the fireplace. The entire atrium of the ministry, which was normally bustling with activity, had been transformed into a lavish ballroom with none of the normal features visible. There were tables with pristine white cloth over them and long buffet-style tables with various elegant dishes that Nick couldn't identify at first glance. The ballroom had few people there already, which made it clear that Nick had arrived early. Probably a tactic by Fudge to get some alone time with me before the other guest overwhelmed him, he deduced easily enough. And lo and behold, a slightly short man with a portly figure and rumpled grey hair walked towards Nick with a wide friendly smile. Mr. Ravenclaw, it is truly a privilege to make your acquaintance. Cornelius Fudge at your service, the man said in such a way that even if Nick wasn't aware before that, he could tell the man was a politician. Nick held out his hand with a respectful and polite smile of his own. Nicholas Ravenclaw, the pleasure is all mine, Minister, he said politely, and Fudge seemed surprised at how well spoken he was, but quickly shook the hand offered and got back into the swing of things. Truly you could imagine my surprise when I received your owl, an enchanter at your age. You are precisely as I imagined, an heir of Ravenclaw, wise, well-spoken and talented in the crafting arts. Did you know that I myself was a member of House Ravenclaw during my time at Hogwarts? Fudge spoke fluently and with great enthusiasm in order to curry favor with Nick. Soon though more and more people started to arrive, so as the host Fudge needed to go greet them, leaving Nick free to find himself a place to sit while also grabbing some food from the buffet table. Chapter 135, Yule Ball, 2. Nick didn't go overboard and secretly ate a bit of Lemba's bread to lower the amount of food he needed to take in without totally ruining his appetite. For the little of his hunger that remained, Nick merely snacked on something that looked like mini sausages but was covered in a thin sweet glaze. Once satisfied with his food, Nick found a chair and sat off to the side of the ballroom floor, calmly watching the new people arriving. Malfoy, Nott, Crabbe, Goyle, and even Greengrass all amongst those arriving via Fleur for this party. Daphne's eyes lit up when she found Nick sitting off to the side of the ballroom, openly observing everyone else. She leaned over to her parents, who were looking for a place to be seated themselves. My friend is sitting over there, perhaps we should join him, she said while pointing Nick out to them. Both of her parents looked amused at the request and sized Nick up, and both raised an eyebrow at what they found. As well-established political figures, the Greengrass couple were adept at reading people based on their posture, expression, and movements, and so they were surprised to find that Nick was nearly unreadable. His body was unnaturally still, as if every muscle was under his control, while he seemed to radiate an aura that demanded respect. It was subtle, but they even noticed how his eyes seemed to hold a sort of detachment to his surroundings despite watching them cautiously. They almost didn't notice that his right hand never strayed far from his wand, as though he expected to be attacked at any given moment. Yet despite all of this, his posture and movements were relaxed and casual, while he had a pleasant, approachable expression on his face. "Yes, let's see if we can't impose on this young man for a seat," Daphne's father Florian said with a small smile at his daughter. The family started to walk over to the table where Nick was sitting leisurely. He noticed this but didn't react at all, since he had accepted such a thing to happen eventually. While she was usually cold on the outside due to her occlumency, Daphne really did prefer to surround herself with only people she got along with. Once the family started to get close, Nick stood up and politely greeted Daphne's parents. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Greengrass, to you as well, Daphne," he said politely with a friendly smile. The two adults returned his greeting and Daphne merely nodded at him. "Do you mind if we join you at this table?" Florian asked politely, and Nick shook his head. "Not at all, please help yourselves," he said honestly. The family seated themselves with Daphne sitting next to her mother Arabella Greengrass and Nick sitting next to Florian. "I apologize for any tension the marriage proposal may have had on you and my daughter, but it is an opportunity I would regret not making an attempt at," Florian said honestly, catching Nick off guard. He recovered easily, though I admit it was awkward for a bit after getting it, but we both understood the reasons behind it. "To be honest, you weren't even the first person to send such a thing to me," he said with a chuckle. Florian smiled widely at this. "I have no doubts about that at all. I am sure you must be rather overwhelmed with everything that has happened since your heritage was ousted," he said, fishing for information in the way only a skilled politician could. Nick shrugged. "Not really, I had always assumed that such a thing would eventually become commonplace, though I admit I had hoped it would take much longer," he said calmly. This seemed to catch the entire Greengrass family off guard. "Why do you say that?" Arabella asked curiously. "I assume Daphne has spoken of me to you both to some degree, correct?" Nick asked, relaxed. The two adults nodded in agreement. "Then you should be aware that I am by no means an untalented individual. The truth is that I have no intention of settling for mediocrity both within and outside Hogwarts, and this meant politics such as this were merely a matter of time even before my heritage was revealed," he said honestly. They thought about it for a moment and could only agree that if he didn't settle for the good enough status that most settle for after leaving Hogwarts, politics were indeed only a matter of time. Nick chatted with the Greengrass family casually for the rest of the party, minus a few interruptions via the other people coming to curry favor with Nick. Daphne had offered to take him dancing, but Nick declined on grounds that he both didn't know how, as well as being unwilling to do so. Chapter 136, Presents. Once the party was over, Nick left some parting words with the Greengrass family as well as Minister Fudge and returned to Hogwarts. It was only once he reached the castle that he visibly relaxed and sighed in relief. Dumbledore was nowhere to be found in the office when Nick arrived, so he simply left without any issue and made his way to the common room to get changed for sleep and get rid of the gel in his hair. After that he dropped into bed and passed out, mentally exhausted from all the stress of the party. The next morning Nick woke up at his normal time and stretched before heading to the workshop to start making his Christmas gifts. That was the best part of his forging ability at this time of year, as he could simply spend a few hours crafting in order to cover his whole list of people getting gifts from him. It wasn't a very long list of people, mind you, as it was the twins, Harry, Ron, Hermione, Tracy, Daphne, Hagrid, Flitwick, McGonagall and finally Snape, who deserved something for actually giving a shit even if you couldn't easily tell. For the twins he simply sent them some spells good for pranks that he found in the ancient section of the library alongside a ring of protection each. Nick was going to give each person a ring of protection each to begin with, so anything after that was technically the actual gift. For Ron he forged a set of chess pieces out of dragon steel before having them enchanted by Flitwick. Hermione got a translated version of the Magical Fundamentals book from the ancient section just without the dangerous to him parts. The rest, however, was where things got tricky for Nick to make the gifts. For the rest he needed to forge and enchant very specific things that will prove to be fairly irritating. Knowing this, Nick fired up the furnace and waited for it to heat up while chatting with Helena. "Any idea when Flitwick ought to arrive?" he asked while chewing on a chocolate chip cookie. Helena shook her head. "He said sometime today, but when that is exactly is beyond my knowledge," she said honestly. "Rather irritating, but I suppose it doesn't matter much," Nick said with a shrug before switching the furnace over to Dragon Flame and grabbing an ingot of mithril from the pile of ingots. He tossed it into the fire and waited for it to heat up, which didn't take very long at all thanks to the high heat of the fire. Taking the ingot out with a set of tongs, Nick set the white-hot metal block on his anvil and began to beat it with his hammer. He wasn't shaping it however but rather completely flattening it into a sheet of metal. Once that was done he took the hammer to the rough edges of the sheet until the thing turned into a circular shape. He then carefully made a single small hole in the center of the plate before slowly and carefully widening the hole until the disc turned into a thin but sturdy circular object. Nick then reheated the now much cooler metal before he started to bevel the edges to a sharp point around the entire thing. If it wasn't clear already, Nick was crafting one of the only ring-shaped weapons he was familiar with, a chakram. He quenched the weapon in oil before polishing it to a razor-sharp point and carefully set it aside. He then grabbed a dragon steel ingot and placed it in the furnace before waiting for it to heat up. It was at this point that Flitwick finally entered the workshop with an eager expression on his face. Sorry for the delay, the Weasley twins were causing mischief with some enchanted snowballs and queerness, he said apologetically. Nick nodded in understanding. I haven't gotten very far into my work for today, so you haven't missed anything much, Nick said honestly. Wonderful. So what do you have in mind? The small man asked excitedly while noticing the chakram but not understanding its purpose here and so ignored its presence. Right now I was about to forge the body of my Christmas gift for Hagrid, Nick explained while taking the white-hot metal out of the furnace with his tongs and placing it on the anvil. Flitwick stood at the side watching in interest as Nick began to hammer the metal into a dense cube. He noticed the strangeness of Nick's hammer during this process but couldn't figure out what was so special about it despite it clearly being so. Nick carefully put a hole through the cube, followed by another and another until the cube had a strange look to it. Chapter 137, presents, 2. Nick then put the holy cube back into the fire to get close to melting before taking it out and carefully severing the metal at certain points. This in the end created two separate rings of metal spiraled around each other like a loosely braided rope. Flitwick was clearly impressed with this as it was a very precise piece of work. Nick paid this no attention however as he focused on smoothing out the points where the metal had been severed. Soon he had the metal work done, leaving the part Flitwick really wanted to see, the enchanting contract. Nick said seriously, and the small man wasted no time at all taking a parchment out of the pocket of his robes. Nick grabbed before looking at the professor with a very serious expression. Once I sign this there is no going back, are you 100% sure about this? He asked sternly and Flitwick nodded. I am too old to get into a craft so I resolved myself to secrecy to see your own, please sign the contract, the small professor said with a reassuring smile. Nick nodded and didn't waste any more time signing the contract right away. A set of magical chains shot out of the contract the moment he did and wrapped around Flitwick's wrist before sinking in, leaving a black chain tattoo in its place there. Nick stored the contract in greed after that and walked over to the door and locked it before going back to the anvil where the unfinished ring sat. Holding his hammer, a white and gold glow began to rise from his body before quickly settling on his right hand and the hammer it was holding. Flitwick let out an audible gasp and had his eyes bulging out of his head in shock. Nick ignored this however and began to fill the channeled energy with his understanding of nature animals, both normal and magical. This changed the color and feel of the energy visibly, at which point he raised the hammer and struck the ring on the anvil, causing it to start to glow and hum. Layman. Beast. Nick spoke and struck the ring again, but this time the glow extended out from the ring a bit in a fuzzy glowing word in Elvish script. He raised the hammer again. Quintaro. Speaker. He said and struck the ring, which now had two words appear. Nick repeated this process for the next hour before finally speaking a new word on the final strike to name the ring NOS. Kindred. Immediately Nick grabbed the anvil to steady himself as the standard bout of weakness came over him. Are you okay? Flitwick exclaimed as he rushed over to check on Nick. I'm fine, the process just takes a lot out of me is all, Nick said honestly. I will be honest, Mr. Ravenclaw, I have no idea what you have just done, but even I can tell it was profound and far more powerful than any of us imagined, Flitwick said seriously before sighing. Part of me wants to immediately report this as a dangerous and valuable technique, but I know that I can't. I now understand why you insisted so much on secrecy. If word of this technique got out, I shudder at the things people would do to acquire it, Flitwick said seriously. Nick nodded seriously before taking a loaf of Lemba's bread from greed and immediately downing a whole corner of it. What is that? Flitwick asked, not recognizing the superfood. Lemba's bread, a single bite is enough to feed an adult for 3 days, Nick said honestly while the small professor looked at the unassuming loaf in shock. You just ate an entire corner, by my estimate that's close to a week's worth of food, Flitwick said concerned. Nick laughed at this. No need to worry, Professor, my technique works every muscle in my body, so I require an extremely large amount of energy after each time I forge, he explained with a grin. That's why you tend to eat so much during meals, Flitwick said in realization, and Nick nodded in agreement. Nick transfigured his robes in a pair of shorts, leaving his upper body exposed to the professor's sight. The small man looked at the balanced and well-defined musculature in awe for a few minutes before Nick undid the transfiguration on his robes, turning them back to normal. Thanks to all of my hard work, I currently have a perfectly balanced physique that will only improve as time passes and I grow. Nick explained proudly. It would seem we were all wrong about your future. Flitwick said with a wry smile, and Nick chuckled but didn't say anything further. Chapter 138, presents, 3. Nick looked over the ring he had just made carefully while secretly using the system appraisal on it. Despite neither of the two people outside himself present being able to see the system, Nick wasn't going to risk it getting known at all. Nick knew that the system was one of the only secrets that he would never share with another person. He was fine with this knowledge as well, since all things considered it didn't affect anyone else at all other than himself directly. Sure, all of his crafts and unusual items from the system may draw attention, but since they can't be stolen, it didn't matter much at all. Ring name, NOS. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Autosizing, Bestial Empathy, Nature's Kin. Description, an exquisite ring forged to bring its wearer close to nature and improves the wearer's ability to understand beasts. System appraisal, a fine ring worthy of any druid created by an up-and-coming ringsmith. Nick was satisfied with this ring as it was perfect for Hagrid, as the half-giant loved all things nature, and if druidic magic was a thing still would probably be a master of it. Flitwick looked over the ring but frowned as he couldn't exactly identify what it did. It allows the wearer to understand beast better while being favored by nature itself to a degree. Nick explained, seeing the professor's confusion. The small man laughed when he heard this. A perfect gift for Rubius, he'll love it, I'm sure. He said with a wide smile. Nick nodded. That's the idea after all. Give me a couple of hours and I'll have the energy to start working on McGonagall's gift. He added and sat against the wall to meditate. Celebrimbor had been hanging about the mindscape for a while now, and when he wasn't training Nick's combat skills, beating him senseless, he was giving small tips and tricks that weren't included in the crafting style knowledge. One such piece of knowledge was how meditation could improve the rate at which he restores his energy, letting him forge twice a day rather than once. If you don't mind me asking, how did you come across this Niffler? Flitwick asked after transfiguring a chair to make himself comfortable. Nick didn't open his eyes but smiled and told the story of how Steve tried to rob him and he made a deal with him instead, and so he just decided to stick around. Flitwick smiled at this and explained that to goblins Nifflers are considered ideal pets due to their natural treasure hunting disposition and love of all that is shiny. To the point, in fact, that most of the species was kept in captivity by goblin clans. The Nifflers still in the wild were the few required by law to be left alone in order to ensure the presence of them in the ecosystem. It was an interesting piece of information, even if technically useless to Nick. After 2 hours of meditation he opened his eyes and stood up as his energy had recovered for the most part. McGonagall's gift was a bit unique for Nick, as it wasn't a something that helped its wearer in any real regard. First he threw some gold into the dragon fire and waited for it to melt before taking it out with his wand and separating a glob of liquid gold the size of his pinky. The rest was dropped into a square mold to solidify, while this glob was allowed to cool in the air to a solid state again. Nick then began the process of carefully shaping the metal into a narrow tiny rod with a rectangle block at the end of it. Once this shape was achieved, he started to carefully flatten the end of the rectangle not connected to the rod. He then took a hair-tin blade to the flattened part. He carefully split the flattened part into thin hair-like shapes that were then carefully woven together, finally letting the entire piece look like a broomstick. Nick began to carefully curve the handle of the broom until it nearly touched the end of the bristles, officially turning it into a ring. After that he carefully polished the entire piece to a high shine that had Steve staring at the ring covetously. Finally the hard part came as Nick laid the ring on the anvil and began to glow once again. He filled his channeled energy with some of his knowledge of legilimency, specific illusions, and finally all of his knowledge on Quidditch. The final result that he hoped for and willed the enchantment towards was to create a sort of Quidditch illusion video game that was controlled by the wearer's mind. This ring was the first one that Nick had attempted creating, whose only purpose was entertainment. According to the system it was a resounding success as well. Ring name, Playmaker. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Autosizing, Quidditch Simulation, Mind-Controlled, Adaptive, Realistic Perception. Description, an brilliant item forged to allow its wearer to enjoy a game of Quidditch at any time. System Appraisal, a marvelous creation made by an up-and-coming ringsmith. Chapter 139, Second Sacrifice. Nick was overcome with a familiar sense of weakness after he finished the ring, but Flitwick had anticipated this and held him steady with a spell. Nick wasted no time at all, slipping the broom-shaped ring on his finger and mentally willing it to activate. Immediately a Quidditch pitch appeared out of thin air but in miniature, and Flitwick gasped in awe. Nick ignored this and willed the game to begin, and he felt a slight weight on his mind as the two teams of faceless broom riders appeared in formation on the illusory field. Once he injected his own understanding of how each position could play from the game he had seen and the books he had read, the players began to move on their own. Flitwick was amazed at how realistic the game was, as there was fouls and a point counter included, as the NPCs played the game based on Nick's admittedly limited understanding of the game. Nick took the ring off and placed it inside Greed alongside all the other gifts he had prepared. What was that? Flitwick finally asked, eager to understand the amazing thing he had just witnessed. I knew that McGonagall loves Quidditch, and so rather than give her some lousy trinket that wasn't much use to her, I mixed several normally separate fields of magic together to allow her to have a game at her fingertips at any given moment. The best part though was that the enchantment will slowly adapt and become more realistic as she controls it more and more. Nick explained proudly. Marvelous. Truly just remarkable. Flitwick exclaimed happily. If it wasn't such a pain, I might have thought about popularizing rings such as this, but as you can tell, making even one is my limit for now. Nick said honestly. It's a pity, but there's always the future. The half-goblin said encouragingly. Indeed, for now though I'm starving and it should be dinner time, so let's go fuel up. Nick said with a grin, and Steve seemed to agree as he climbed onto Nick's shoulder ready to go. The student and professor chatted casually on the way to the Great Hall, unaware of the chaos happening in another part of the world. Earlier in the day in Germany, a group of 12 people had appeared suddenly outside an isolated town alongside one man in particular, Grindelwald. Today we will take another firm step towards our goals and the betterment of all of wizard kind. Grindelwald spoke without any spell, and yet all of his followers heard him clearly and looked eager to start the activity. Erect the barriers so we may begin. The Dark Lord said, and all of his followers ran off to surround the town, much like the previous one they had sacrificed. Once alone, Grindelwald shed a tear while looking at the town. I will not dare ask for your forgiveness for my actions, and only hope you can understand the reason for them. He said quietly but sincerely before stealing his expression. Dinner was a grand affair like always, with many different types of rich holiday foods like roast turkey and thick rich gravy. There wasn't many people in the castle at the moment, as most had gone home for the holidays. This didn't apply to the Weasleys, Harry, and a few other students, however, as they had all stayed. I still don't get why you are still working so hard, Nick. It's the holidays, you know, time to relax. Ron said in exasperation. Crafting helps me relax. Nick said with a shrug. You are bloody hopeless. Ron complained, and the entire Gryffindor table laughed. It was a cheery and good atmosphere for the entire meal, and even Dumbledore seemed to be in an especially jovial mood. After returning to his office, however, this mood was ruined when the news of what had happened previously in the day came through. What do you hope to accomplish, old friend? Dumbledore thought, saddened by the news of yet another town being sacrificed for some mysterious purpose. Fawkes tried to comfort Dumbledore, but he was so very tired and simply wasn't open to it at the moment. Nick woke up at dawn as per usual and went for a quick hour-long jog around the school grounds to energize his body. Breakfast started out the same as usual, with the food getting served before the owls that delivered mail arriving. The Great Hall fell into silence, however, when the headline of the paper was read. Dark Lord strikes again. Terror grips the world. Having such a thing happen so close to Christmas removed any positive feelings that most people had, leaving today dark and dreary. Chapter 140, Final Gifts. Even in the workshop, neither Nick or Flitwick were in any mood to make jokes or exchange banter after the news. Despite this, Nick focused on making his gifts for his friends, and thankfully he merely needed to enchant another 4 items before Christmas, so he should be able to laze about after tomorrow. For today he was working on finishing Flitwick's gift as well as making Harry's in its entirely. The plan for Flitwick's gift was that chakram he had made previously, but enchanted in such a way that it flew on its own and could be controlled by the man's thoughts. The half-goblin was a master of charms and a champion-level duelist, so Nick wanted to make him something that would put both of those titles into practice. A flying chakram sounds fairly harmless at first until you add in the fact that Flitwick could use spells in combination with it, effectively making him like facing 2 opponents from 2 different directions at once. Obviously Nick wasn't going to enchant the thing in front of the man, since that would kill the pleasant surprise when he unwrapped it on Christmas. To start out Harry's gift, Nick started by grabbing an adamantium ingot, a mithril ingot and a goblin silver ingot, and put them all inside the furnace at high heat to melt together. Flitwick furrowed his brows at this sight, as he couldn't understand what appeared to be such a wasteful action. Nick took out his wand and pointed at the strange liquid metal in the furnace and began to glow as he pushed his spiritual energy into his wand. Rumenya kanena goyena nua. Bye. "The fire I command you to join as one," he spoke, and a glowing white and gold mist floated out of the wand's tip before sinking into the liquid metal, inciting a change. The three different colors began to swirl in the center of the furnace before folding into one another, leaving a much smaller puddle of metal that Nick immediately removed from the furnace into an ingot mold temporarily. With a focused transfiguration, Nick changed the shape of the ingot mold into the shape of a bracelet loop and then waited for the liquid metal to cool into its new shape. "What spell was that?" Flitwick asked, slightly shaken at the unbelievable scene he had just witnessed. Nick shook his head to show that he refused to explain himself in this particular case, which told Flitwick that this was a very secret thing. He could only accept that this was one secret he won't be learning and move on to the mold with his attention. The reason Nick refused to answer the question was to make Flitwick think that what he did was exclusive to his crafting knowledge and thus impossible to find elsewhere. The truth of this matter was that this was merely the ancient form of spell casting that used Elvish instead of Latin or some other language to achieve its effects. Nick hadn't needed to practice much to grasp this method of casting due to its similarity to his crafting technique, but each spell he used with it drained his spiritual energy reserves a bit in addition to his magic. Still, after waiting for 20 minutes, Nick undid the transfiguration on the mold, causing it to spit out the loop bracelet in the process. The design was a simple solid loop, but the metal itself was a dark jade green and shimmered from the raw magical potential held within it. Nick carefully put the bracelet on the anvil and began to channel his spiritual energy, causing him to glow again, but it was different this time as the glow was nearly blinding. Nick wasn't planning to take his time as most rings required, but rather was going to force the full load of energy into the metal all at once, as he was confident it could handle it. The very air trembled and shifted, creating a draft in the room, and Flitwick retreated cautiously from what his instinct told him was very dangerous. The energy started to turn fierce and aggressive, but at the same time protective, before Nick slammed the hammer down on the loop, unleashing the full brunt of the energy into the metal. A blinding flash of light filled the room before vanishing entirely as it was taken into the metal that hummed violently for a moment before being still. "Fia Akar. Spirit of Vengeance," Nick said, naming the piece after its purpose. This bracelet pairs up with the protective ring Nick gave Harry for his birthday to create both pure defense and retaliation. Ring name, Fia Akar. Grade, Rare. Abilities, Autosizing, Growth, Bound, Punish, Retaliation. Description: an powerful bracelet that serves as the sword meant to protect its wearer while growing more powerful with them. System appraisal: a great defensive bracelet created by an up-and-coming ringsmith. Chapter 141, Final Gifts, 2. Nick was quite satisfied with this bracelet, but also rather happy that he wasn't totally exhausted after enchanting it, since very little of his energy was wasted due to the short duration it was active. He was still quite tired since he had still enchanted something, but at least he hadn't almost collapsed. "What was that about?" Helena asked curiously, and Flitwick shared the same sentiment. "Normally I need to slowly infuse the energy into the metal, or else I risk shattering the ring, but in this case I simply put in all the energy at once since I was confident the metal could handle it," Nick explained calmly. Both of them nodded in understanding, but Steve seemed offended by the blinding light it had been subjected to. Nick rolled his eyes at the big drama queen before eating some lembas bread alongside his muscle potion. He then told the professor that he was calling it a here for now and that he was going to take a nap. Flitwick wasn't bothered by this, as there was nothing wrong with what Nick said since it was the holidays, and if he wanted to nap he could. Nick did indeed take a nap, though it was only an hour, followed by an hour and a half of meditation. He then quickly enchanted the chakram for Flitwick's gift and stored it away in greed, and actually calling it a day and heading to the Great Hall for dinner. It was a quiet evening, as few people had recovered enough to speak after the horrible news this morning. Nick ate his share of food before turning in for the night alongside most of the rest of the Gryffindor dorm, including the twins. The next day was much better, as the newspaper reported that the Ministry had caught one of Grindelwald's followers and sentenced them to the Dementor's Kiss. This lifted the students' spirits considerably, but after personally reading the article Nick knew it was a lie, as there were too many conflicting points in the story. Probably a ploy to keep the panic down. He thought with a sigh, while not feeling bad for the Ministry at all, since the whole organization was corrupt to its core. Maybe the wizards who worked there weren't corrupt, but the organization itself very much was, and it allowed monsters like Grindelwald and Voldemort to come into existence. Nick felt bad for the people of the towns as well as their families, as all of those lives were now ruined because of a single wizard who should have been killed long ago. Nick shook his head to get rid of these thoughts and finished eating before heading to the workshop to finish up his gift list with Daphne's and Tracy's gifts. For Daphne he made an occlumency ring similar to Sanner, but a bit weaker since it lacked the mind art affinity that Sanner had. Tracy's gift, however, was fairly simple, as it was merely a ring with the ability to correct her wand movements based on her memory of the subject. This would help her immensely with consistency in casting, which she has a bit of a problem with. It wasn't a cheat in that it suddenly made her great at casting every spell, but it made it easier for her to go further than she would normally. Once these were done, Nick wrapped each of the present, labeled them, and handed them off to the Hogwarts house elves to distribute on Christmas. He then ate dinner and turned in for the day, satisfied at the amount he had gotten done. The next day he woke up at dawn and stretched before lazing about next to the fire in the common room with some cookies and milk. Surprisingly, no one seemed to know that you could summon a house elf for service in the common room. Nick didn't blame them either, as he only found out thanks to his magical senses telling him that one of the lion busts could be pressed for an effect. So now he could sit next to the warm fire with a snack and a drink as well. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, so today Nick decided to basically spend the whole day doing pretty much nothing. He got a lot of surprised faces when the rest of the dorm started to wake up, and when asked about it he simply said that he had finished all his necessary work. Ron of course took the opportunity to challenge Nick to wizard's chess and lose. It was funny to see the grizzled veteran pieces have shocked faces at losing the battle. Wizard's chess pieces were enchanted with semi-sapience, so the game was closer to actual battle than Muggle chess. Chapter 142, Theories and Changes. Nick took it easy for the entire day as well as Christmas Eve itself, which actually proved to bother his friends, as by now they were used to him being who knows where whenever he had free time. The fact that he was actually lazing about all day was such a change from normal that it caught them totally off guard. Not to say that they weren't happy to hang out with him, merely that they found it strange is all. They weren't the only ones either, as Dumbledore had also noticed this irregularity but saw it as Nick simply enjoying his holidays and left it alone. It wasn't all relaxation, however, as after his public appearance at Fudge's ball Nick received even more letters from various pureblood houses looking to try and take advantage of his young age and inexperience. Nick simply ignored these people entirely and burned their letters after reading them, as he had no time to entertain fools. What bothered Nick the most, however, was the complete lack of action on Voldemort's side during the holidays when the castle was nearly empty. I would have used this opportunity to try and decipher the rest of the defenses around the stone, but maybe he's waiting for a better time. Nick thought with a shrug. It honestly didn't matter in the end, since Nick had already deduced that the stone in the castle was likely a fake. The reason he thought so was due to both how easily it was destroyed as well as the fact that the Flammels were said to die after this year. A fun little fact about the famous alchemist was that he had faked his own death no less than 7 times in his long life before resurfacing a few decades later. Nick doubted that the man would actually give the key to his survival to some else, even if that person was his longtime friend and student Dumbledore. Still, it doesn't matter to me though, as I still need to figure out my own problems, he thought, remembering the newest change he had experienced. This was in reference in fact to the golden color that had begun to appear during his forging sessions. Apparently the shift in his soul's existence was starting to physically manifest on his spiritual energy, which came with its own problems. First and foremost was that this was causing his mere presence to begin to shift ever so slowly, which isn't a problem yet but is bound to be noticed eventually. This was the beginnings of his elvish self starting to become clear. See, according to Celebrimbor, even though they looked almost identical to humans, no elf could ever be mistaken as such due to this sort of natural presence they had that felt almost unearthly to the mortal races. In magical terms, once he fully transforms into an elf, Nick will feel qualitatively different than most other wizards. Thankfully, however, this could be explained away by a surprisingly high number of things, as wizards have been known to have strange presences due to their magic. If asked about it, Nick could easily pass it off to his bloodline magics and no one would bat an eye at it again, not even Dumbledore. Another problem that came with this, however, was that it was a forerunner to his body itself beginning to shift. By his and Celebrimbor's estimations, he had a month from now left of being fully human at most. Nick's biggest concern was how the fused soul of the celestial bird into his own will affect this change. Clearly his magic was bound to skyrocket as a result of it, but as for his appearance he had no clue. Still, Nick decided to let the change run its course and enjoy the benefits it brings him while worrying about the problems later. Christmas Eve was a jittery time in the castle as everyone was anxious to see what presents they got. "I bet Mum's made both of you sweaters, so be prepared," Ron said with a grimace. "It can't be that bad, right?" Nick asked curiously. Ron sighed. "Sure, they're comfortable, but my sweater is always bloody maroon of all things," he said, exasperated. "Cheer up, mate, that's a noble color in Muggle culture," Nick said comfortingly. Ron looked surprised. "Really?" he asked, clearly curious. Nick nodded. "Yep, Muggles long ago had a great deal of trouble getting cloth the color blue, purple, or maroon, so any clothes made with those colors were only used by the nobles or royalty, hence making them noble colors," he explained honestly. Ron seemed happy to know this fairly useless piece of information, as it served to make him less uncomfortable at the idea of wearing such a horrible color. Chapter 143, Christmas. The entire castle went to sleep early in hopes of bringing the next day to them even faster. Nick ended up waking up at around 5:30 in the morning as his magical senses picked up on a sudden shift in the dorm room. Seeing the piles of presents at the end of each of the beds, he figured out that it was merely the house elves delivering the Christmas presents. Checking the time, he could only sigh and get up 30 minutes before he normally would and get dressed before quickly making his way to the top of the astronomy tower. He made it just in time to watch as the sun rose from the east and bathed the land in red, purple, and yellow for the briefest moment. Always worth it to see the rising of the sun just as it is to see it set, he thought with a smile. He took his time walking back to the common room since he had plenty of time before people started to wake up. He made sure to stop by the workshop to wish Helena and Steve a Merry Christmas. After that he went back into the common room and into the dorms right as Ron, Neville, and Harry were starting to stir. Nick merely transfigured a chair next to his own presence with a smile and waited for the inevitable excitement to come over the boys. Neville was the first fully awake and active as he eagerly dove into his presence without even noticing that Nick was up. He didn't get much, but what he did get seemed to make him light up as he had tears in his eyes and a wide smile as he held a letter that was attached to one of his 4 gifts. Nick usually didn't like prying, but he managed to catch a few words with his good vision that told him all he needed to know. They awoke on. He looked away after that, as even though this was his doing, he refused to take any credit for it, and merely knowing was enough to satisfy him. What's the point of knowing how to help if you refuse to act, he thought with a smile. Ron and Harry both woke up fully at the same time, but Ron was the most animated out of the two as he tore into the wrapping of the gifts ruthlessly. Harry seemed stunned that he got presents at all and vocalized it. Will you look at this? I've got some presents, he said, surprised. Ron snorted. What did you expect, turnips? He said sarcastically. Harry grabbed the first of the presents and unwrapped it, revealing a wooden flute that he blew into, creating a sound much like an owl. The next gift was the sweater sent by Mrs. Weasley. That was a thick emerald green sweater that he put on immediately with a smile. After that was Hermione's gift of chocolate frogs, then Tracy's of every flavored beans. Daphne's present was a book of the pure-blood Potter family. Ron's jaw dropped when Harry unwrapped the invisibility cloak though. I've heard of those, he said, dropping the box of every flavored beans he had gotten from Hermione. If that's what I think it is. They're really rare and really valuable, he said seriously. It's an invisibility cloak, Nick said, finally cutting into the conversation. Both of the boys looked at him startled. Bloody hell, almost lost my skin just now, Ron complained. Nick shrugged. If you had been paying attention you'd have noticed that I've been here since you woke up, he said casually. Besides that, I imagine that note should say who the cloak is from, Nick said, pointing at the paper that had slipped out of the cloak when Harry held it up. The boy who lived lifted the note up and read it out loud, but looked confused and surprised when he did so. Must be Dumbledore, he's the only person who would have had the cloak for so long, Nick said, directly ousting the old man's mysterious act with the whole not leaving his signature thing he did. My gift is below that cloak, by the way, Nick said with a smile. Harry moved the cloak aside, and indeed there lay the shimmering green bracelet with a neat bow on it. Much like your ring, that's no mere accessory but rather will defend you should it need to, Nick said seriously. Ron looked jealous for all of the 2 minutes it took for him to unbox the hand-forged dragon steel wizard's chess set that Nick had made him in all its gleaming metallic glory. He fell in love with the pieces immediately and looked eager to give them a spin. Chapter 144, Christmas, 2. Nick finally started to open his own presents after that, while Ron and Harry watched curiously to see what he got. First up on the list was his own sweater made by Mrs. Weasley that was cobalt blue in color. Nick put it on with a smile before moving on to the next package that was from Hermione. Much like the other two, he received candy in the form of chocolate frogs, which he immediately ate one of. Next was a small package from Daphne that contained a small box that contained a tiny white spark that Nick recognized immediately as a cold fire flame seed. Cold fire was a strange magical fire that formed in extremely frigid environments when a magical flame goes out in just the right way. It was, however, amongst the easier fires to obtain thanks to a wizard that discovered how to create the flames artificially. Nonetheless, it was a wonderful gift to receive for Nick, and he stored it away in greed immediately. Tracy's gift was merely more chocolate frogs, but Nick was still happy to get them. Flitwick also sent Nick a gift in the form of a tome of crafting-related spells. This was extremely precious information and Nick was eager to dive into it, but held off and stored the tome in greed for later. Hagrid had also sent Nick a gift in the form of a bundle of demiguise fur, which confused Ron and Harry until Nick explained that the fur was used to create invisibility cloaks similar to Harry's. Nick knew that much like Harry's gift, his wasn't something bought by Hagrid but collected himself, likely from the Forbidden Forest that had a small population of demi-guys within it. Contrary to what it may seem, Hagrid was very wealthy from all these years collecting and selling the discarded materials of the Forbidden Forest. The final gift after that was a gift from Dumbledore that surprised Nick quite a bit considering how tense the relationship between the two of them was. It was a simple quill made from a red and gold feather that he recognized as Fox's. There was a note attached to the quill that Nick read quietly. Fox, and I wish you the happiest of holidays and hope to see the marvels held in your future. Sincerely, Albus Dumbledore. Nick cautiously checked the quill for any unusual magic, but there was none. It was a simple quill made with the feather of a phoenix, which was anything but simple for anyone other than Dumbledore himself. He stored the quill away before finally standing up. Hurry up and get dressed so we can go get breakfast, he said with a grin as his friends scrambled to find a proper pair of pants to wear. The twins were already in the common room waiting on Ron and their older brother Percy. Oh? Would you look at that, our favorite Firsty and Harry both have Weasley sweaters and even Ronnykins has his own on, Fred said with a surprised expression. The reason Nick knew it was Fred was because that particular twin had a ring on his left hand and the letter G on his sweater. The twins had this habit of swapping identifying things between them to the point that if you figured out which of them was which, you could rely on this to find which of them was Fred and which was George. I take it you both were pleased with your gifts? Nick asked with a knowing smirk. Very much. Oh, the things we will accomplish, George said excitedly. Ron looked suspicious of the conversation since he knew his brothers well and the only thing that got them so excited was pranks. Still, he was distracted from this when Percy finally showed up without wearing his sweater despite holding it. The twins pretty much forced the older boy into spending the day with his family rather than with the other prefects. To be fair, he didn't exactly argue with it either, so it didn't take much effort. Breakfast was a special time as the entire Great Hall had been decorated in Christmas themes and even the enchanted ceiling has Christmas lights floating overhead. Everyone was in a good mood as all of the professors, even Snape, seemed slightly receptive to the cheer of this day. It hadn't been mentioned previously, but for the potion professor, Nick had created a book that contained nothing save for potion recipes that had been lost to time that he found in the ancient section of the library. This gift clearly pleased the man as he wasn't even half as moody as normal. Flitwick was happily flying loops overhead with his chakram while McGonagall had an audience as she used her playmaker ring with great joy. Chapter 145, A Flight and Strange Event. Nick got into a massive snowball war thanks to the twins that maybe got a little out of hand after breakfast. They have us pinned down, mates, and I see no hope of a sacrifice-less victory. Avenge me, Nick said dramatically while tanking the hail of cold snow to cover for his friends to approach the twins. It was all in all a good day for Nick, full of laughs and smiles the entire time. Dinner was a grand feast of all the Christmas favorites as well as wizard crackers. Unlike the Muggle version of the things like made a quiet sound and shot out confetti, these were loud and released totally random things when used. A good example of this was that Nick had personally seen the things release live mice, a wizard's chess set and even a broom. Harry got the chess set while Nick got the broom, much to Ron's jealousy. Usually first years weren't allowed to have their own broom, but due to the circumstances of his acquisition no one made a fuss about it. Still, Nick planned to sneak out later that night to truly let loose for the first time on a broom. It was right after dinner that Nick snuck off to the astronomy tower with his broom without telling anyone. Hogwarts' astronomy tower was cold and covered in snow since it hadn't been cleaned during the entire holidays. None of this mattered to Nick, however, as he mounted his broom and silently floated above the ground before leaning forward to accelerate. The broom shot forward like a bolt of lightning and the air whistled past Nick's ears. He didn't pay any attention to how he moved on the broom and simply let instinct guide him as he zipped across the sky at breakneck speeds. A wide smile covered Nick's face as he leaned back on the broom, causing it to fly straight up until he flew right into a cloud. It was cold and wet, but he shot straight through the cloud and found himself above the clouds under the pale moonlight, more alive than ever. In a crazy maneuver he flipped the broom and released it with his hands as he fell into a rapid spiraling freefall. The black lake grew closer and closer, but Nick was completely relaxed as the entire sky was his domain and he could never crash while in it. A mere instant before he would have smashed into the lake at terminal velocity, Nick curved the broom underneath him and transferred all of his downwards momentum forward, causing him to shoot over the top of the lake, leaving a huge wake behind him from the air pressure. If anyone with in-depth knowledge of broom riding were to be watching, they would be astonished at how nimble and fast Nick was in the air, as if he was born to fly. After a couple of hours flying about the sky, Nick finally landed on the astronomy tower and began to carefully return to the Gryffindor Tower. Filch had caught the trail of someone sneaking about the castle thanks to a book in the forbidden section of the library having been disturbed. Nick was surprised at this since Harry already knew about Nicholas Flamel and had no reason to break into the forbidden section like he did in the book. Nick was good enough at transfiguration that he sank into a wall seamlessly as Harry rushed by him on the first floor and into one of the disused rooms of the castle. Nick's magical senses told him nothing of the boy's presence, which chilled him a bit as it showed the power of a deathly hallow. There was not even the tiniest ripple in the magic nearby as Harry moved through it when not even Dumbledore's disillusionment charm accomplished this. The fact that the old man was following Harry explained why he had went to the restricted section. The old goat is still trying to manipulate Harry for some reason. Nick thought with narrowed eyes. He had assumed that with his presence Dumbledore wouldn't risk it since Nick was greatly affecting Harry's personality, but apparently this wasn't true. The wall of the castle rippled as Nick transfigured his way out once he was sure Filch wasn't coming and walked over to the door Harry and Dumbledore entered. He pulled it open, startling Harry, who no longer had his cloak over himself. "Nick? What are you doing here?" Harry asked, confused, and Nick chuckled. "I snuck out to play around on my new broom. What about you?" he asked while showing the broom in his left hand. Harry changed the subject and pointed out the large ornate mirror in the center of the otherwise empty room as well as what he saw in it. Chapter 146, The Mirror. Nick purposefully didn't look at the mirror itself but rather the decorated metallic frame around it that had letters in the English language written on it. Ariststra eruoid u bakafruoid on wosi. Nick read the words out loud before scoffing and reversing and correcting them. "I show not your face but your heart's desire." The Mirror of Arist, a cruel and powerful artifact that has driven many to madness. Nick said with a chilling coldness. Harry could tell that something was wrong as Nick didn't seem angry at the mirror but rather at something over in the corner of the room as he glared at that spot. "Diffindo," Nick said, sending the cutting charm straight at Dumbledore, but the old man simply dropped his disillusionment spell and sidestepped the spell calmly. He could tell that his spell was ineffective against Nick and didn't want to escalate the boy's anger further. "Try to remain cool-headed, young man," Dumbledore said calmly despite having a wand pointed at him still. Harry looked stunned and confused to see that Dumbledore himself was here and that Nick had attacked him seemingly out of nowhere. "You brought this cursed thing into a school full of children and then had the nerve to purposefully lead one of them to it. Why don't you tell Harry here what effects this mirror had on people?" Nick said coldly while glaring daggers at the old wizard. "What is he talking about, Professor? What is happening right now?" Harry asked Dumbledore, confused and hopeful that the man had a good explanation. He's the greatest wizard in the world, so he must have a good answer, right? Harry thought while looking at Dumbledore hopefully. Unlike Harry was expecting, however, the old wizard refused to meet his gaze and had a look of guilt. "You won't do it? Fine, I'll tell him myself, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong," Nick said with a scoff at the man's caught in the cookie jar act. According to the story, a nobleman with great wealth commissioned an artifact from a fae to protect his great wealth from thieves. The nobleman, however, never intended to pay the fae for their efforts and thought to trick them into giving the artifact to them for free. They failed, however, to account for the fact that the fae saw through their treachery. He paused for a moment. The fae were spiteful creatures, however, and so created a mirror that could serve as a secure vault for any treasure, but came with a cruel trick. The mirror showed the objects of one's most heartfelt wish, but only those who wouldn't use the treasures within could take them from within it. The nobleman proudly stored the entirety of his fortune within the mirror and mocked the fae for being tricked, but the fae merely laughed at the nobleman and vanished with the wind. It was only when the nobleman sought to remove some of his fortune that he realized what the fae had done. Nick paused again. The nobleman could see his great fortune within the mirror but couldn't touch a single coin of it, but without it couldn't hire someone to fix the fae's trickery. Nor could he afford food or water to survive, but rather than understanding his plight, the nobleman wasted away in front of the mirror until he eventually died, as the object of his heart's desire was always within sight and yet he could not tear himself away from it to save himself. That very same mirror went on to claim countless more victims until it was sealed away for the safety of the world. Nick explained seriously. Harry had a look of horror on his face when he looked at the mirror now, after understanding why Nick was so angry about it. The good professor here not only brought such a thing to a school of children but also lured one of them to it, you Harry. Or will you deny this and say that Harry's illogical and out-of-character actions and your presence here are merely a coincidence, Professor? Nick asked Dumbledore coldly. You don't understand. Dumbledore started, but Nick stopped him. No, I understand perfectly. You are trying to make him into the hero the world thinks he is, but I refuse. Heroes always die needless deaths, and I won't allow him to take that path because of anyone other than by his own choice. Understood, Nick said while flaring his magic at the old man alongside some of his spiritual energy in his eyes for added effect. The older wizard looked slightly shaken by this but eventually sighed in defeat and nodded before leaving with his head hung down in shame. Chapter 147, White Wizard's Woe. Dumbledore was ashamed that despite everything he not only failed to gently lead Harry down the path he needed but had even been exposed and berated for his lowly actions. He didn't blame Nick for exposing him and ruining any chances of Harry listening to him, as the boy was right to be angry. The mirror of Arist's effect on those looking into it had driven even those with strong wills to madness, so knowingly exposing a child to it was unconscionable. Yet in hopes of making sure that Harry wouldn't take the path of Voldemort, he had done precisely this. Harry and Voldemort had been tied together by prophecy, and Dumbledore hoped that Harry would end his pupil's influence in the world for good rather than simply replace him as the next Dark Lord. With Gellert out and about preparing for who knows what, preventing yet another Dark Lord from appearing was very important. There isn't only bad news, however, as it is clear that both boys are good at heart even if misguided in one of their cases. The old wizard thought with a small smile and a hopeful glint in his eyes. Nick meanwhile was finally alone with Harry, and so he took a look at the mirror itself finally. Within it he saw an older version of himself sitting in a soft-looking chair within a vast library playing with a miniature galaxy with a smile, as a hard-to-make-out woman sat in his lap leaning against his chest looking at him in adoration. Nick tore his gaze away from the enthralling vision presented to him with great effort. "What did you see?" Harry asked, curious to know what Nick's deepest desire was. "I saw the future," Nick said cryptically before having Harry hide them both under the cloak and return to the Gryffindor dorms. The next morning neither Harry nor Nick told any of their friends of the events of the previous night, as it would do no good. Instead of creating a fuss over the headmaster's actions to no effect, Nick instead went directly to the one person in the school that might give the old man trouble over it, Snape. Nick knew well Snape's love for Lily, and even if he doesn't seem like it, Harry himself and so knew that the man would very much confront Dumbledore after learning what happened. Nick wasn't disappointed either, as the moment Snape learned of what happened he had an ugly expression and quickly vanished from Nick's sight. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Snape was going to give Dumbledore a piece of his mind. While this wouldn't shake Dumbledore's hold over the man, it would make Snape more cautious about leaving him alone with Harry. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but remember that Snape is Dumbledore's favorite person to have do his dirty work or spy on Voldemort's activities while in the castle or elsewhere. Both of the two older wizards realized that Nick was pitting them against each other, but didn't mind since he used the perfect point to do so. Dumbledore had promised Snape that Harry would be safe and then directly broke that promise, while Nick's part was merely pointing it out. If anything, both parties were happy to see Nick's cunning in actions, as it meant he got rid of his anger by doing so. A talented young wizard with a lot of anger but nowhere to direct it is a recipe for bad things to happen, so him venting his rage using these methods was better than him turning to dark arts. An interesting thing that Dumbledore learned, however, was that a member of the faculty, specifically Professor Sinistra, had witnessed Nick's aerial prowess last night. Apparently she had been studying the heavens as she was prone to do as an astronomer via her personal setup outside the castle, and discovered him. To be fair though, Nick wasn't being very subtle with his aerial movements and made a considerable amount of noise from the air pressure. Not enough to be heard through the thick walls and windows of the castle, but plenty to be picked up while outside. According to the professor, watching Nick fly gave the impression of seeing an inhuman level of control over one's body and broom. Each movement was precise and full of natural grace and were performed at frankly frightening speeds. Dumbledore could only take note of this information and not act on it, as the agreement between him and Nick still stood despite yesterday's events. The headmaster finally left these thoughts behind and focused on trying to track down Grindelwald to stop whatever he was planning and find out why he broke the agreement. Chapter 148, Shifting Forces. The agreement was very much a sort of magically binding contract between Grindelwald and the entire wizarding world. In exchange for his life after his defeat, Grindelwald was required to spend the rest of his days within the walls of Nurmengard Castle unless he discovered a way to serve the wizarding communities without targeting the statute of secrecy or dominion over muggles. For nearly 50 years Grindelwald had remained in Nurmengard Castle since he refused to change his mind about his ideals. Yet he chose this year to begin acting out in a matter that seemed nearly identical to before, yet Dumbledore could tell that the contract was still in effect. It was a well-known fact that Grindelwald was a natural-born seer whose gift manifested through his right eye that was silver in color. He must have seen a way forward, but I don't understand why he is acting this way if this is true. What did you see, old friend, to go so far to realize this future of yours? The headmaster thought deeply before sighing and dispelling Voldemort's magic, trying to tap into the school's wards for the 15th time this year. For the entire time Voldemort had been sneaking about while possessing Quirrell this year, he had been trying to find a way to sink his claws into the school's wards in order to try and take them over. But every headmaster of the school has reinforced the wards placed by the founders and added to them, making them nigh impossible to breach. Arrogance always was one of his biggest flaws after all. The old wizard mused as he thought about the trouble his old student had caused while thinking none of the other professors were aware of his presence. In truth, nearly half of the entire teaching staff was aware of him but had agreed to act oblivious while setting a trap for him. Snape, Sprout, McGonagall, Flitwick and Dumbledore were all involved with setting an elaborate trap for Voldemort, but each stage of the trap was also designed to be solvable by the first-year students while also being nearly harmless to them. Take for example the Cerberus guarding the room with the trapdoor to the second test, Fluffy. The magical creature was very well trained and was commanded to only attack with lethal force adult wizards while it was to capture the children who may enter the room. The final part of the trap was planned to be a very different matter as it involved a slightly altered version of the Mirror of Eris meant to trap souls like Voldemort's current state. Such an alteration took time, however, so the mirror had been placed in a disused room while Dumbledore slowly finished the changes to it. Dumbledore made sure to play on his old student's pride by having Quirrell set up a level in the trap as well. This meant once the trap was sprung, Voldemort would fall to his own overconfidence and finally be taken care of until such time Harry could strike him down for good. Voldemort himself was starting to have serious problems with Quirrell's body and soul rejecting his presence. This caused him to start needing to cut back the amount of time that he was awake drastically to buy time. This was only enough to extend his possession by another month or two at most. Knowing the simpleton gamekeeper's obsession with dragons, Voldemort came up with a plan to learn of the bothersome magical beast guarding the rest of the tests, as that was the only test capable of forcing him to waste his power and time to pass. Nick meanwhile was researching organic forging and was having trouble making progress at all as he felt that he was missing some key piece. It was frustrating to say the least, as while certain types of enchantments worked in an unstable manner, others simply refused to take hold or detonated during the forging process. For example, wooden rings held water and fire enchantments in a very unstable manner that made the resulting product low quality and highly explosive. No skill or spell-related enchantment had succeeded in sticking to wood, however, and it frustrated Nick greatly as he could feel it in his bones that it was possible. Bone rings, however, came with an entirely different problem that Nick needed to figure out. They came with an inbuilt affinity to certain magics. For example, the carapace of the acromantula he hunted a while ago seemed to have an affinity with curses and poison enchantments but refused all other types of enchantment. Nick didn't limit himself to just magical creatures but normal ones as well, such as fish, chickens, and cows, but each had their own enchantment affinity that he had to figure out, which was a tedious affair involving a lot of trial and error. Chapter 149, Returning Students. Still, Nick's free time was drastically cut short due to the fact that the last day of December came around and the next day was the start of the next semester of classes. The students that left all returned by this point and settled in. Nick got smothered in a hug by Daphne and Tracy when they returned, as they were so happy with the gifts they received. "Honestly, it wasn't that big a deal as you make it out to be," he said while shaking off the two girls who had noticed his solid body under his robes with astonished expressions. The firm muscles hidden under his loose clothes meant that hugging him was like hugging a rubber ball, not as soft as one would assume. "Putting aside my own Christmas present, you gave her a ring to protect her mind so she can actually live normally. Of course it's a big deal," Tracy said, not accepting Nick's words at all. Daphne nodded and smiled happily while rubbing the loop fondly. Nick simply shrugged and decided to leave it alone, but Hermione actually found an issue with her gift. "Where did you get the book from? I have been all over the normal parts of the library and I have never seen a book with the same title," she questioned with narrowed eyes. Nick laughed the question off. "However, where is the fun in telling you something like that? No need to worry, it's not from the restricted section," he said with a grin. "Humph." She snorted angrily at his teasing but dropped the topic anyways. "Likely planning to try and search the library again for the original. Good luck figuring it out since it's in a lost language entirely alongside the rest of the books in the ancient section," he thought with a chuckle. School continued as per normal after that, and Nick found it odd how the cold and snow were almost immediately replaced with rain and mud within 2 weeks of the start of the new year. Yet another town was reported to have been sacrificed by Grindelwald during this time. Nick was rather desensitized to this kind of news at this point, though he did note that it was always exactly one town per month being sacrificed so far. This made him assume whatever ritual was involved might be obligatory in nature, though this was just a guess in his mind. Harry and the rest of the Gryffindor team were having a hard time, however, during this time, as Oliver Wood had been intensifying the training in preparation for the upcoming Quidditch match against Hufflepuff. If they won, they would officially surpass the Slytherin house in house points for the first time in 7 years. Though to be fair, thanks to the study group Nick started, they weren't that far behind to begin with. Nick didn't participate in the study group, but it helped the other Gryffindors greatly. The problem most Gryffindors had was not that they were stupid, but rather that they had a hard time getting interested in the material enough to want to study. Thanks to Nick turning studying into a trivia-style competition, many were motivated to do so, finally turning most of the whole first-year portion of Gryffindor into decent students. This didn't change the fact that the house was still the most lazy academically, though, just that the gap wasn't so wide anymore. I can't believe bloody Snape of all people is going to be reffing the game. Ron complained about the news they just got. I can't just drop out of the game though, since we don't have anyone else to cover the seeker position. Harry said bitterly. He can't do anything to you anyways, since all eyes will be on him for the calls. Nick said casually. Harry's face brightened up when he heard this, as it was true that any foul play by Snape would be noticed immediately since he'll be the referee. I still think you guys are wrong about him, Daphne said, trying to defend her head of house. Nick had never actually said whether or not Snape was as the other Gryffindors thought, but they assumed he agreed with them. He wisely stayed out of the argument over that topic, as spilling Snape's personal background to defend him both served no purpose, as no one would care, and also it was not his place to do so. Rather than get dragged into it, Nick instead teased Steve on his shoulder with a shiny golden galleon. See, he came up with a game between the two of them where Nick would move the coin through the air at random, and if Steve managed to catch it he could keep it. He hadn't yet though. Chapter 150, Ambitious Project. The next day was a rather important one for Nick, as he was finally going to attempt making a ring wraith. It was little surprise that Helena had eagerly offered to serve as a guinea pig in this endeavor without any hesitation. Thanks to the detailed knowledge of the crafting style, Nick knew that the ring itself didn't need to be very powerful in order to create and maintain a ring wraith. In fact, the rings given to the humans barely had any powerful enchantments at all. First and foremost was that the wearers were invisible, as their bodies resided in the astral realm. Only their spirits walked the world in a physical manner, and as a result they did not age, as time bore no meaning in the astral realm. Nick's rings instead could directly skip placing the physical bodies in the astral realm and focus on the physical spirit aspect of the rings. The second ability that all the rings of power that made the ring wraiths had was that it allowed normal mortals to become powerful sorcerers by tying their power to Sauron's. Once again, Nick could skip this aspect, as one of the prerequisites for becoming a ghost was being magical. It was for this reason that there weren't far more ghosts around, since muggles tend to die with unfinished business, as well as strong rejection of passing on, which were the other requirements for the formation of a ghost. Instead, he was planning on tying the rings to him in such a way that they fell off should the ghost wearing them turn against him. With the requirements to create a ring wraith ring having been lowered so much thanks to these reasons, Nick guessed that he may be able to create a ring wraith with his crafting ability far below Celebrimbor or Sauron's. The biggest hurdle for him, however, was that unlike both of them, his energy pool was vastly inferior in quantity. Celebrimbor was an elf over 1,000 years old, while Sauron was basically an immortal fallen angel. Needless to say, a soul equivalent to a 14-year-old's in age didn't hold much in the form of power in comparison. Nick's soul would be worth nearly 30 years had his memories and knowledge of his previous life not been stripped from it. The term knowledge is power applied quite literally in the case of wizards in this world. A wizard learns and grows older, their souls grow stronger naturally, so the 27-ish years of knowledge would have made Nick's soul considerably stronger had they not been stripped from him. Quality of soul, however, is an entirely different matter, as right now Nick's soul was fusing with the spirit of the celestial bird while also becoming elven in nature, making it qualitatively superior to any normal wizard's soul by many tiers. This qualitative difference is what allowed Nick to learn so fast, as otherwise he would be only a bit above average in terms of learning talent. What do you think would be a good material for something like this? Mithril or something else? Nick asked Helena, who was waiting eagerly nearby in the workshop. She seemed to fall into thought for a few moments with a serious expression. Meanwhile, Nick had already turned the furnace on and switched it over to his new cold flame, sending a chill throughout the workshop. The paradoxical nature of the cold fire seemed the best choice out of those available to him for making a ghost into a ring wraith. Even Celebrimbor agreed that this was likely the case, since he honestly wasn't sure, as there were few types of magical fire in his world and he had only ever used sun flame out them. Sun flame was a fire that contained lots of positive energy and as such had purifying properties against curses and imperfections in metals. It existed in this world as well, however it was notoriously hard to get since it only appeared during lunar eclipses and tended to die out within a couple minutes of forming on Earth. This made getting the stuff an act of serious luck on someone's part, as you not only needed to be near it but also prepared to contain it as well. Soon enough Helena seemed to decide on a metal as she looked at Nick and said seriously, "You should use blood silver." Hiss. He sucked in a deep breath in surprise and horror when she said this. Blood silver was a dreadful metal created by extracting the iron contained in the blood of wizards or other magical beings while they were still alive before being mixed with mithril and magically sealed in a jar of blood for no less than 6 days. The metal had the unique property of being extremely powerful when enchanted with dark magic and was even theorized to have some connection to soul magic. Helena was likely referring to this when she made the suggestion, but Nick refused to even attempt to make the horrible stuff. No. he said firmly, and while she looked a bit disappointed at his response, she could still accept it and fell into thought again. While he waited for her to decide on the material, he took stock of his collection of metals. 4 billion Argentine pesos of goblin silver, 12 billion Argentine pesos of dragon steel, 7 billion Argentine pesos of mithril, 2 billion Argentine pesos of orichalcum, 2 billion Argentine pesos of adamantium, half a bar of star metal, and plenty of base magicless metals, he thought as he sorted the pile of metal. He hadn't purchased any more metals after raiding the metal held within the room of requirement, as he hadn't felt the need to. Most of the rings he had made since that point merely used magicless metals, while a rare few used the precious magical metals he had. Mithril should suffice, though it has no known ties to souls. Helena finally said with a small frown. Nick ignored this, since he knew it was only from the less than optimal conditions of this attempt. Grabbing a bar of mithril, Nick placed it within the furnace while gritting his teeth at the cold that hit him during this process. Strangely, the metal started to change color as though it was heating up, and even melted within the flames. Using his wand, Nick removed the liquid from the furnace and separated a certain amount before placing the rest in a mold to reform into an ingot. The amount he removed from that, however, was shaped into a small sphere before being allowed to cool, heat up. Once solid and work-able again, Nick placed the sphere on the anvil before immediately hammering it flat on two sides like a coin. It was much thicker than a coin, of course, but the idea remains the same. He then carefully began to create a hole in the center in order to turn the metal into a ring. He needed to put the metal back in the furnace to become workable once again, but managed to finally get a hole through the center of it finally. He then started to shape the metal into a simple band ring while being careful not to stress the metal too much and cause cracks. After an hour of work he was done with this and could finally try and enchant the ring. He started to glow, filling the room with a bright gold and white radiance that soon was focused on his hand and hammer. Cool. Wraith. He spoke and struck the ring with his full intent and knowledge of what he wanted. The ring hummed, and a fuzzy elvish word briefly shone next to it. Sorna. Steadfast. He spoke another word upon his next strike, causing both to appear next to the ring that was humming even more intensely. Nam. Appear. He struck yet again, causing 3 words to appear next to the ring, and Nick repeatedly chanted these words as he struck the ring again and again. After about 3 more hours of work he finally felt the rebound of energy that signified that the enchantment had fully binded to the ring, and spoke one last word with his final strike, Nazgul. Ring Wraith. The ring stopped humming after that and sat on the anvil, radiating a cold blue shine off of it as it waited for someone to use it.